Malcolm Rhodes was just the black janitor mopping floors at Silvergate, until a billionaire walked in speaking only Mandarin. The manager panicked, the staff froze, and Malcolm answered in flawless, poetic Chinese. What no one knew was that this moment would drag buried corporate racism into the light, ignite protests across oceans, and force powerful men to face the truth they'd spent years hiding. But every word Malcolm spoke came with a cost, and someone was ready to silence him before the world heard the whole story. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning light spilled through Silvergate Financial's glass facade, turning the marble lobby into a cathedral of white stone and polished chrome. Every inch of the space was designed to whisper wealth, the gold trim along the elevator doors, the soft hum of classical music in the background, the scent of imported lilies standing in tall vases near the reception desk. The people who walked in here came to talk in millions, sometimes billions. They wore suits cut so sharp you could measure the angles. They moved with the confidence of those who had never been told they didn't belong. In the far corner, half hidden by a potted ficus, Malcolm Rhodes worked in silence. He was bent over a mop bucket, his dark blue janitor's uniform pressed and neat, his posture straight even in the act of scrubbing the floor. The faint streak of silver in his hair caught the light whenever he moved. His presence barely registered with the staff who passed him. Or perhaps it did, but in the way one notices a lamp or a waste bin. Useful, unremarkable, and beneath consideration. At the reception desk, two young associates in tailored jackets leaned toward each other as they spoke in low voices. Their eyes flickered toward Malcolm for half a second, before quickly darting away, like the mere act of looking too long might invite some unspoken discomfort. One of them, a sandy-haired man barely out of college, made a subtle sidestep as Malcolm wrung out the mop, avoiding coming too close, not because of the wet floor, but because of the man cleaning it. The air changed at precisely 9. A black sedan glided to a stop outside the lobby's revolving doors. Two men in dark suits stepped out first, scanning the building's entrance with practiced precision. A third figure emerged, a moment later, shorter than his escorts, but somehow commanding the space around him. Pleasant. His name was spoken in boardrooms across continents, always in tones of respect and calculation. A billionaire investor from Shanghai, his ventures shaped industries overnight. When Li Jian walked into a room, markets listened, and now, without announcement, he was here. The first person to see him was the receptionist, whose perfectly rehearsed smile faltered for just an instant before snapping back in place. Behind her, one of the associates straightened his tie and whispered, "That's him, the Mandarin-only guy." As Li Jian stepped inside, he paused, taking in the lobby's architecture with quiet curiosity. His face was unreadable, but his eyes missed nothing. The lilies, the gold trim, the faint echo of footsteps. When the receptionist greeted him in English, his polite nod was followed by a measured stream of Mandarin. The words rolled like water over polished stones, smooth and steady, but entirely unintelligible to the staff. The smile on the receptionist's face froze. Her eyes flickered toward the glass offices above, as if hoping someone with the right skill set might magically appear. The associates exchanged nervous glances. In this building, English was the only language anyone truly needed to survive, or so they thought. From the mezzanine above, Cliff Harding descended the wide staircase like a man heading into battle. Cliff was Silvergate's branch manager, the kind of man who wore his authority like a bespoke suit. His graying hair was trimmed to corporate perfection, his cufflinks gleamed, and his smile was as practiced as a politician's. He'd built a career on reading the room and bending it to his advantage. But the sight before him now made something sharp twist in his gut. "Mr. Lei," Cliff called out, voice smooth and booming. He extended a hand, but Li Jian, still speaking Mandarin, didn't take it. Cliff's smile held for a beat too long before he let his hand drop. The panic was subtle at first. A glance toward the reception desk, a quick hand gesture to the associate. "Find a translator." "Now," he muttered under his breath. One associate pulled out his phone, fumbling to search for Mandarin interpreter near me. Another ran toward the elevators, muttering about someone in accounting who might know a few words. The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. If Silvergate couldn't handle a walk-in from Li Jian, the embarrassment would ripple far beyond this lobby. Deals, reputations, futures, all at risk because no one in this multi-million-dollar branch could hold a conversation in the language of one of their most influential potential clients. Malcolm kept his head down, the rhythmic swish of the mop marking the seconds. He had been in this building for nearly 6 years. He had learned to be invisible here. People looked past him, through him, sometimes right at him, without ever seeing him. That was how you survived in places like Silvergate. You made yourself small. You left your history outside. But now, from his quiet corner, he watched the scene unfold. The frantic whispers, the forced smiles, the widening gap between what Li Zhen was saying and what anyone in this room could understand. Li Zhen's gaze drifted slowly across the lobby. It lingered on the gold-trimmed elevators, the floral arrangements, the anxious young associates, and then, unexpectedly, it settled on Malcolm. It wasn't the quick, dismissive glance Malcolm was used to. This was different, focused, deliberate, as if Li Zhen saw something the others did not. Cliff noticed it too, and stepped halfway into Malcolm's line of sight, subtly blocking it. "Sir," he said over his shoulder, "could you maybe work in the East Corridor for a while?" His voice was polite enough to pass as casual, but the undertone was clear. Not here. Not now. Malcolm dipped his head slightly, turning back toward his bucket. His fingers tightened around the mop handle, but his expression gave nothing away. The search for a translator grew more desperate. Someone suggested using a translation app on their phone, but the lag was unbearable, and the output laughably awkward. The receptionist kept nodding and smiling at Li Zhen, as though politeness could bridge the chasm of language. Through it all, Malcolm's eyes followed the billionaire's gestures, the way he paused between sentences, the tone of his voice. He understood every word. A memory tugged at him standing in a sunlit courtyard half a world away, chalk in hand, teaching a group of eager teenagers how to conjugate English verbs. The laughter when they got it wrong, the pride when they got it right. It had been years since that life. Another lifetime entirely. Now Li Zhen was asking something again, his brow slightly furrowed. The room's energy shifted from polite discomfort to quiet embarrassment. Cliff's jaw tightened. The associates exchanged helpless looks. Malcolm's mop stilled on the marble floor. For a heartbeat, the lobby seemed to hold its breath. Then, in a voice low enough to seem almost accidental, Malcolm said, "Nin xiang kunaga huiyisha." The words, flawless, melodic Mandarin, floated across the space like a stone dropped into still water. Heads turned. The receptionist blinked. Cliff's face drained of color. Li Zhen's expression changed instantly. Surprise first, then recognition, then something warmer, like the flicker of a smile. And in that suspended moment, every unspoken rule about who mattered in this building, and who did not, threatened to break. The lobby had gone still, as if someone had turned down the volume of the entire building. The only sound now was Malcolm's voice, a low, fluid current of Mandarin that seemed to carry more than just meaning. It carried history, respect, and an ease born of years, not months, of living inside the language. Cliff Harding stood frozen, caught between disbelief and a creeping heat, rising up his neck. It wasn't just that Malcolm spoke Mandarin. It was how he spoke it. The tones were exact, his cadence unhurried, and dignified, each word polished like river stones. It wasn't the clumsy, half-learned chatter Cliff had imagined a janitor might know from a phrase book. This was mastery. Li Zhen's face shifted from polite reserve to genuine interest. A rare smile formed at the corners of his mouth. "Your tones are perfect," he replied in Mandarin, the deep timbre of his voice carrying approval. "You've lived there, haven't you?" Cliff caught none of it. The conversation was an unbroken chain of foreign syllables, each one shutting him out. But what stung more than the incomprehension was the simple, humiliating fact that every eye in the lobby was now on Malcolm. The billionaire, the reception staff, even the building's security, all attention had turned toward the man Cliff had never once considered as anything beyond the edges of the room. Malcolm answered Li Zhen with a small nod and a phrase that carried an almost poetic weight. His voice was steady, unhurried. It was the sound of a man unafraid to speak, even in the room where he was expected to remain silent. Cliff's jaw tightened. He forced a thin, brittle smile. "All right, Malcolm," he said with the patronizing calm he used on interns who didn't know better. "Thank you for the help, but we'll get a real translator for this meeting." The word hung between them, sharp and cutting. Real. Malcolm's hands stilled on the mop handle. His eyes lifted to Cliff's, not with anger but with a depth of calm that was almost more disarming. "Mr. Li seems to understand me just fine," he replied in even English, his tone stripped of any apology. Li Zhen's gaze flicked briefly to Cliff, the faintest narrowing of his eyes betraying that he'd caught the insult, even without knowing the word itself. Cliff stepped closer, lowering his voice as though he could contain the moment. "This is high-level business, Malcolm. There are terms you wouldn't know. We can't risk." Malcolm didn't respond. His mind had already drifted, unbidden, to a memory. The crowded hum of a Beijing night market, the air fragrant with ginger and roasted chestnuts. A group of students clustered around him, laughing as they practiced English verbs, their cheeks red from the cold. The warmth of those evenings had been more than temperature. It had been belonging, a life before this one. Lejeune spoke again in Mandarin, gesturing toward the elevators. "Would you escort me upstairs?" Malcolm hesitated, not because he doubted himself, but because he understood the weight of that invitation in this building. The upper floors were glass and gold, spaces meant for suits, not janitors. Cliff, sensing control slipping further, stepped in quickly. "Sir." Lejeune lifted a hand, stopping him mid-sentence without even looking his way. His gaze stayed fixed on Malcolm, his tone polite but firm. "Please," he said again in Mandarin. The lobby was silent except for the faint hum of the elevators. A receptionist's fingers hovered over her keyboard, frozen mid-typing. One associate shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between Cliff and Malcolm. Malcolm set the mop against the bucket, straightening until his shoulders squared. In that moment, the uniform he wore seemed less like a marker of station, and more like a disguise. "Of course," he replied in Mandarin, the syllables rolling smooth and confident. It was like a ripple across still water. The billionaire's face softened, the tension in the room bending toward this unexpected center of gravity. Cliff tried again, his voice tight. "Malcolm, why don't you get back to your cleaning? We'll take it from here." Malcolm looked at him without blinking. "I'm following Mr. Lee's request," he said simply. Lejeune chuckled quietly at something Malcolm said next in Mandarin. It wasn't a dismissive laugh. It was the sound of shared understanding, of something the rest of the room couldn't touch. "What did you just say?" Cliff asked sharply, his smile cracking. Malcolm's answer was measured. "Nothing you need to worry about, Mr. Harding." The subtle sting in those words made Cliff's teeth clench. This wasn't just about language anymore. It was about control. And for the first time in years, he wasn't the one holding it. The three of them stepped into the elevator. The mirrored walls reflected their strange formation. Lejeune in front, Malcolm at his side, and Cliff slightly behind, no longer leading. As the doors slid shut, the billionaire leaned toward Malcolm, speaking in low, easy Mandarin. Malcolm responded with the same warmth, their voices carrying the cadence of two people who understood each other beyond vocabulary. Cliff stared at the numbers above the door, his mind already crafting a plan. He would call HR the second he reached his office. He would find a translator with the right credentials, the right pedigree, someone the board would approve. Then he would make sure Malcolm was reminded, in no uncertain terms, of his place in the company. The elevator chimed. The doors opened to a hallway lined with glass offices, the air cooler, quieter and more rarefied than the lobby below. Lejeune stepped forward, then stopped, turning to Cliff. He spoke in deliberate accented English. No. Only him. For a beat, Cliff thought he had misheard. "Excuse me?" Lejeune repeated himself slowly, as if ensuring the words left no room for misunderstanding. "Only him." The meaning landed heavy. This wasn't just preference, it was a dismissal. The billionaire was choosing his voice, his representative in this space, and it wasn't the man in the suit. Cliff's jaw worked silently before a thin smile stretched across his face, brittle and dangerous. Malcolm, standing beside Lejeune, said nothing, but in his chest he felt the weight of the moment, the rare, undeniable shift in how he was being seen. The boardroom door opened ahead of them, and for the first time Malcolm would step inside, not as the man who cleaned the floors, but as the man the billionaire insisted stand beside him. The elevator doors parted onto the executive floor with a soft sigh, and the hush up here felt curated, like wealth could be distilled into air. Thick carpet muted footsteps, floor-to-ceiling glass framed a quilt of Manhattan steel, and the boardroom waited ahead with a polished mahogany table that seemed to stretch for miles. Malcolm stepped out beside Lejeune, aware of Cliff's presence half a pace behind, prickling with urgency. He'd never walked this corridor as anything but a shadow. Today the light seemed to follow him. Inside, a half-dozen executives already sat arranged by rank, posture and practiced smiles. A wall screen glowed with a title slide. Silvergate, LZ Holdings Strategic Discussion. Porcelain cups sat on saucers no one touched. Eyes flicked up as the trio entered. Quick inventory, quick judgment, the quiet calculus of who mattered. Cliff cleared his throat, as if to reset the room's hierarchy. Everyone, Mr. Li Jun. And this is Malcolm. He'll help until our interpreter arrives. His tone packed the word until with expectation, a temporary deviation from the correct order of things. The CFO, Victoria Ames, immaculate bob, pearl studs, folded her hands, a sliver of disbelief in her gaze. Housekeeping is joining us? She asked softly, to no one and to everyone. A whisper that behaved like a blade. General Counsel Brent Coe didn't look at Malcolm, only moved a notepad closer. For compliance, we'll need an NDA on file, he said, as if labeling a box. Malcolm heard every syllable without flinching. He moved to a chair near the projector cart, a place where people set down things they didn't want to carry. Before he could sit, Li Zhen gestured to the chair at his right, an empty one that had waited like a day. Here, he said in Mandarin, his face calm. By me. A hush with edges cut through the room. Cliff's smile thinned. Victoria's fingers paused on her pearl pen. Slowly, evenly, Malcolm crossed to the seat of honor and took it. He felt the weight of the table, the way his uniform absorbed and reflected their surprise. He placed his hands flat, grounded. Li Zhen rested his palm lightly on the table and began in Mandarin, voice a measured river. When I was a boy, he said, my grandmother kept accounts with a pencil stub, so small she held it with her fingertips. She would say, numbers are honest, people must learn to be. Malcolm translated, not just the words but the warmth. Mr. Li says as a boy, he watched his grandmother keep books with a pencil, worn to a whisper. She told him that numbers do not lie, people must learn to live up to them. Across the table, an executive from strategy, Seth Adler, lifted his chin. That's charming. We're eager to discuss the control provisions for the acquisition vehicle. Malcolm felt the temperature of the sentence. He turned to Li Zhen and shifted the tone, respectful and precise. In Mandarin, he said, they are asking about decision rights. They want to know how the steering wheel is shared. He let the metaphor soften the sharp edge of control, then sent back a translation just as carefully sanded. They'd like to understand governance and how decisions will be shared. Victoria tapped her pen. Control. We mean control, she repeated, as if the syllables themselves were currency. Li Zhen's mouth barely moved. His gaze smoothed the room. He said in Mandarin, partnership that begins with grasping ends with broken fingers. The language carried a proverb's gravity. Malcolm let the proverb bloom. Mr. Li proposes stewardship over possession. Grip too hard, and you break the very hand that holds you. He didn't apologize for the poetry. He let it sit where numbers couldn't reach. Brent slid a term sheet forward. Let's ground this, he said. Equity split, board composition, veto rights. We have a timeline that requires decisiveness. Li Zhen listened. Still. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a ledger being evaluated against older books. Ones written in patience, favor, and face. He replied in Mandarin, slower, deeper. You speak of timetables. I speak of seasons. Money is quick. Trust is slow. Malcolm carried those seasons into English. He values rhythm over rush. Funds move fast. Trust blooms by season. Seth exhaled a small laugh. We're doing botany now. Eyes ticked to Malcolm, expecting him to shrink. He didn't. He remembered winter markets in Beijing, steam rising from cups, the language living in his lungs. He gave no lecture, only clarity. He's saying if you force ripeness, you get something that looks like fruit but tastes like fiber. For a flicker of a second, a smile touched Li Zhen's face, barely there, like sunlight skimming a lake. He turned back to the term sheet. Ask them, he said in Mandarin, what they offer when the numbers wobble. When the wind shifts, do they offer patience or penalties? Malcolm asked it plain. When volatility hits, what do you bring, understanding or punishment? Victoria's brows lifted. We bring covenants, mister. She paused, searching for a last name. Cliff supplied it quickly, like a stamp. Rhodes. Mr. Rhodes, we bring covenants. She angled the term sheet toward him as if it might teach him to read. They build discipline. Li Zhen's gaze found the paper, then Malcolm. He said in Mandarin, softly, discipline can be love or fear. Ask which this is. Malcolm took a breath. Let the phrasing land gently. He asks whether your covenants are stitched with partnership or with punishment. For the first time, Brent looked directly at Malcolm, really looked. And how would you tell the difference? He asked. A legalist, testing a hinge. By where the burden falls, Malcolm said. No translation needed. If risk breeds equally, you've made a home. If it exiles one party, you've made a trap. The room adjusted around that sentence. Cliff shifted in his chair, measuring this unexpected center of gravity. He had spent a career cultivating a voice that sounded like certainty. Now certainty was standing, quite inconveniently, on the side of the man in the blue uniform. The door opened a crack. An HR assistant slipped in with a laminated badge and a clipboard. She whispered to Cliff. He whispered back. A minute later, a woman entered. Sleek headset, black portfolio, the official interpreter. Her smile was brisk. Practice.
Cliff brightened. Mr. Lee, our certified interpreter is here now. We can—
Lei Zhen didn't look up. No, he said with the kind of quiet that carries finality. Only him. He nodded toward Malcolm. The interpreter hesitated, caught in the crosshairs of hierarchy and client insistence. Cliff's jaw tightened. We'll have her stand by, he said through a smile that had a vein of steel. Lei Zhen continued, and the day unspooled. He spoke of a logistics venture in Shenzhen that thrived not because they won every quarter, but because they outlasted every storm. He spoke of his daughter's startup, how he had learned to be silent while she failed, then soared, then failed again. Family braided with finance, patience braided with profit. He spoke in images because in his world, numbers lived better when they had faces. Malcolm translated with the subtlety of a hand guiding a lamp. He never reached for grand words when small ones carried truth. When a proverb wandered in, he let it keep its shoes on. He chose stewardship where control would bruise, seasons where deadlines would corner, and when the executives pressed for comfort, he did not blunt Lei Zhen's standards. He let the steel inside the velvet show. Seth gestured at the screen. Let's talk KPIs, he said. Target margins, expansion velocity. We've prepared scenarios. A cascade of charts filled the glass wall. Arrows climbing, bands narrowing, confidence intervals hugging ambition. Lei Zhen looked, then turned to the window. The city stacked like a ledger. He shifted in his chair and, without warning, changed his cadence. The Mandarin softened into something rounder, tones slipping into the glide of Wu. Shanghainese, rolling like water over river stones. It was a test, veiled as a reminiscence. He mentioned childhood noodles, a ferry crossing, a proverb about roofs and rain, in a dialect that could elude even seasoned Mandarin ears. Unexpected heat rose to Malcolm's face, not from panic but from recognition. The dialect tugged a thread he hadn't pulled in years. He'd learned this music in a kitchen above a dumpling shop. Late nights with a family that fed him tea and language without ledger. He let the rhythm find him, and answered in the same dialect, careful, respectful, just enough to show he hadn't memorized a script. He had lived a life. Lei Zhen's eyes warmed. A private son. He nodded once, barely perceptible, a signal received. Cliff caught none of the nuance. All he saw was the billionaire's approval folding itself around Malcolm like a coat that fit. His fingers tapped a slow irritation on the armrest. Victoria recovered her composure first. We appreciate the philosophy, she said, voice smooth. But our shareholders need clarity. What assurance do we have that LZ Holdings won't divert capital from the U.S. entity to its Asian ventures? Lei Zhen replied in Mandarin, the syllables clipping into clean edges. Assurance is a bridge built from both ends. He paused. Show me your end. Malcolm looked at the faces on the far side of the table. He'll match transparency for transparency. Dual reporting, joint audit rights, mutual caps on intercompany transfers. If you build the guardrails together, neither side drives off the road. Brent jotted notes. That's workable, he said, more to himself than to the room. Cliff leaned forward, seizing momentum. And in exchange, we'd want the control clause as written. Malcolm didn't translate control as control. He didn't lie. He told the truth in the right direction. They asked to co-chair the committee that sets strategy, he said. They want shared steering, not a backseat. He turned to Lei Zhen and explained the clause in Mandarin, neutral but unflinching, then added from himself a small thread of context. In their language, this word bites. They think it keeps them safe. Lei Zhen listened, then spoke without looking at Cliff. Safety bought with contempt is a lonely house. Malcolm carried it across the table. He won't accept protection that treats him like a trespasser. The room inhaled. Deal-making had become something else. A negotiation not just of terms, but of what kind of people would sign them. Victoria glanced at the interpreter standing unused against the wall, then back to Malcolm. "Where did you learn to speak like that?" she asked. The question wrapped in a thin veil. "Like that meaning like us, but not one of us." "In kitchens and classrooms," Malcolm said. "And in rooms where people mistook silence for ignorance." She held his gaze a moment, then looked away. The meeting rolled on, the hour thinning and thickening by turns. Term sheets were not amended in ink yet, but in air, ideas written, erased, rewritten in the space between cultures. By the time the cups of untouched coffee had cooled to room temperature, something unspoken had moved. The executives didn't say it out loud, but their questions changed shape. They asked less about owning, more about growing. Malcolm felt his breathing settle into that shift, like a boat finding a current. At the final slide, Cliff reclaimed the performance of closure. "We'll circulate revised language," he said, already rehearsing the email that would narrate the morning in his voice. "Thank you, Mr. Lee, for your time. We'll coordinate next steps." Li Zhen placed a hand on the tabletop, anchoring the room with a gesture. He turned to Malcolm, not to Cliff. "Tonight," he said in Mandarin, voice carrying the ease of a decision already made. "Join me for dinner." Malcolm blinked, the request folding into his chest with unexpected warmth and caution. He began to nod before Li Zhen added the word that rearranged the furniture in everyone's mind. "Alone." The syllables were soft but detonated under the veneer of professionalism. Victoria's pen paused mid-click. Seth's mouth opened, then closed. The interpreter shifted, suddenly extraneous. Cliff's smile faltered, then regained armor. Malcolm felt the room narrow to a single line between himself and the man beside him. He knew dinners could be tests, traps, invitations, or all three. He knew a yes would ripple through this building like a rumor wearing shoes. He also knew, from a kitchen above a dumpling shop, and a courtyard strung with winter light, that certain doors, once opened, don't swing shut without taking a piece of you. He met Li Zhen's eyes. Before he could speak, Cliff cut in with a polished brightness that strained at the edges. "We'd be delighted to host a team dinner, Mr. Lee. Our private dining room." Li Zhen didn't look at him. "No team," he said, gentle and immovable. He turned slightly, speaking only to Malcolm now, in Mandarin that felt like a hand extended and a line drawn. 7 o'clock. I will send a car." The room held its breath, balanced on the hinge of Malcolm's answer. And just as Malcolm parted his lips, a vibration rattled the quiet. The boardroom screen flashed. A calendar invite pulsed, and on Cliff's tablet an email preview unfurled by accident. Its subject line blazing in bold, where everyone nearest could see, "Urgent, HR action on Rhodes." The word action hung in the air like a trap with teeth, and Malcolm's answer lodged in his throat, as every eye snapped to Cliff just as Li Zhen's hand, still and steady, tapped twice on the table, waiting. The room waited on Malcolm's mouth, the calendar alert still pulsing on Cliff's tablet like a siren. Only some people could hear. Li Zhen's fingertips rested on the table. 2 quiet taps, an invitation and a measure of patience. Malcolm felt the gaze of every executive touch his skin like static, the kind that makes you aware of the hairs on your arms. He steadied his breath. "Yes," he said, voice even. 7 o'clock. Li Zhen inclined his head, satisfaction flickering in his eyes. Cliff's smile cupped itself back into place. "Careful. Controlled. Excellent," he said, and the word sounded like it had splinters. The meeting adjourned to the sound of leather chairs sliding and papers stacking. The door opened and the hallway pulled them in with its climate-controlled hush. It didn't take long for sound to return. Not volume, but texture. A hiss of whispers that travels faster than footsteps. "How does a janitor know Mandarin?" one associate murmured as they passed the glass railing. "Not just Mandarin," another breathed. "That was something else." "Did you hear the way Li Zhen laughed with him? Maybe he memorized phrases off YouTube." "Please. That wasn't memorized." The words hovered like gnats, small, persistent, intent on circling a single truth without landing on it. Malcolm didn't break pace. He kept to Li Zhen's shoulder until the elevator, translating 3 final courtesies. "Thank you for your time. We'll provide the revisions. I look forward to this evening," with the same calm he'd carried into the room. Cliff stood to the side of the elevator door like a sentry who couldn't decide whether to salute or block. When the doors closed on Li Zhen, Cliff pivoted. "Malcolm," he said, lowering his voice into a register called management. "A word." The hallway's acoustics were generous. A word carried farther than Cliff intended. Malcolm followed him to a corner near the glass-walled focus rooms, where the city below looked like a scaled model, perfect, distant, unreal. Cliff kept his smile, but the skin around his eyes tightened. You handled yourself adequately, he said, the compliment constructed like a trapdoor. But we have protocols. You don't step into meetings like that without clearance. It creates confusion. Mr. Lee asked. Malcolm replied. I said yes. Next time, Cliff said, you'll say you need to check with me. We can't have mixed signals. He glanced at his tablet, where the email preview still loomed in recent memory. And for tonight, company policy prohibits employees from fraternizing with clients outside group events. Is the policy in writing? Malcolm asked. Cliff's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. I'll check, he said. In the meantime, I'll need you back on the floor. We've had an issue with the East Corridor. I covered it at 7 this morning. Right, about that. Cliff slid his hands into his pockets, casually lethal. We're adjusting shifts to better support executive needs. Starting today, your hours move to 4 p.m. to midnight. Today, Malcolm repeated. Effective immediately, Cliff said, as if time were a knob he could dial with 2 fingers. Also, HR is cleaning up the internal directory. Only salaried staff will be indexed. If anyone needs you, they'll go through facilities. The sabotage was presented like housekeeping. Just tidying, just optimizing. Malcolm let the information settle. Move him to the margins. Scrub his name out of search. Make his presence procedural, not personal. He knew the shape of this dance. It had 1,000 steps and 1 destination. Understood, he said. Good, Cliff replied, relief moving through him like a small private breeze. Let's keep the building running smoothly. By the time Malcolm reached the service elevator, the whispers had evolved. They traveled along cubicle rows, through Slack pings, and side-eye texts, the way any organism learns to survive, by adapting. What's he hiding? One message flashed on a phone held above a paper cup of coffee. How did facilities hire someone like that? Another wondered aloud, near the copy room. Someone suggested a conspiracy, an uncle on the board, a diversity quota fulfilled with flair. Someone else claimed they'd heard him on the phone last year talking to Chinese investors, the phrase loaded like contraband. Malcolm pushed the service cart into the East Corridor, and felt the building reclaim its old choreography around him. He resumed the quiet occupations of his job, sweeping, emptying, wiping, yet each motion hummed with the residue of the boardroom. He was a man back inside his disguise, and the mask now sat differently on his face. Between trash bins, a memory arrived with the stubborn clarity of mountain air. Not Manhattan glass, but a village school in Hunan. Cement floors cool under sandals, chalk dust floating like sunlit pollen. He stood at a blackboard, writing English verbs in careful columns while children echoed him, vowels bright-lipped, consonants crisp from practice. What is to hope? He had asked, and the kids chorused. To hope is to wish for something to happen. A girl with pigtails had raised her hand and added softly, to hope is also to wait kindly. He'd smiled then, struck by the grammar of the heart. How some languages put patience inside the definition. After class, he would drink tea with the science teacher, whose husband raised ducks by the river. They'd sit beneath a crooked fan, sweat glistening along the hairline, and trade idioms like recipes. In those afternoons he was not a novelty, not a shadow, not a problem to be managed. He was a bridge, a neighbor, a man who had a key to the side door of a community that folded him in and fed him until he laughed without checking the room first. The service elevator dinged faintly. The present returned. A facilities colleague, Raina, rounded the corner with a stack of microfiber towels balanced on her hip. Her eyes skimmed his face, reading the air like a weather report. You okay? She asked. Low. I heard things. Rumors travel faster than elevators. Malcolm said. True, she replied. But elevators don't get hungry halfway there. She hesitated. They changed your hours? Effective immediately, he said. That's dirty, she said, then caught herself. You gonna tell that client? He already knows more than he should. Malcolm murmured. Careful, Raina warned gently. Men like Cliff don't lose well. Malcolm nodded. I've noticed. He finished the corridor, marked his checklist, and moved back through the building with the practiced vanishing act of people who keep things intact without being seen. By 3, his name had disappeared from the internal directory. A receptionist searching for him typed Malk, and got nothing but a blank field. Weird, she said to her neighbor. He was there this morning. The neighbor shrugged. If the system didn't acknowledge him, did he exist for the purpose she needed? The building's logic answered for them. In his small locker room, Malcolm found a printed notice. Shift change confirmation. The kind of document that pretends to be a conversation already had. Beneath it, taped without ceremony, was a thin envelope with his name in a looping hand. Malcolm. No sender. Inside, a single photocopy of an old staff memo. Subject: internal candidate. M. Rhodes. The age-yellowed ink cast the past in sepia. Recommend defer. Limited cultural fit for client-facing roles. The sentence had no author name, only initials CH. He stared at the letters long enough for them to rearrange into what they had always been.
Cliff Harding.
The page trembled slightly in his fingers, not from rage, but from recognition. The memo dated back 5 years, months after he'd taken the janitor position, while still sending resumes into the white noise of online portals. He'd once been shortlisted for a junior analyst role. He remembered the final interview, the bright room, the smile that didn't reach the eyes. He remembered leaving the building and pressing his palm to the winter air, as if it could wipe the feeling from his skin. And now the sentence had a spine. He folded the copy, slid it into his pocket like a shard. Across the building, Cliff moved with purpose. He had learned, over a career, that speed was its own tonic. If you sprinted into a narrative, sometimes it bent to your shape. He stopped at HR, all polished courtesy. Quick check on a compliance item, he said, charming the assistant with the warmth of a man who attended everyone's retirement party. He was ushered into a small glass office where the head of HR, a woman named Sloane Mercer, kept shelves of award plaques and a bowl of color-coded stress balls. She offered one. He declined. We're updating contractor files, he said lightly. Wanted to make sure facilities is squared away. Malcolm Rhodes. Can you pull his packet? File completeness, background checks, that sort of thing. Sloane typed, frowned slightly, then brightened. Found him. A few clicks. A printer hum. She slid a manila folder across the desk with the indifference of routine. Please don't remove original documents. Cliff opened it, assuring chuckles and compliments at the ready, and saw first a resume, not the squeak of a mop in bullet points, not a collage of odd jobs to survive a city. A resume that read like a map of the world. Malcolm Rhodes. Languages: Mandarin, near native; Shanghainese, conversational; French, professional. Education: MA International Economics, Georgetown; BA Comparative Literature, Morehouse. Experience: Regional Consultant, Sino Bridge Advisory, Beijing, Guangzhou; Program Lead, Rural Education Initiative, Hunan; Research Fellow, Trade Policy Institute. Selected achievements: negotiated supplier terms for mid-cap electronics firm. Margin lift 8.2%. Designed bilingual curriculum. Adopted by 3 provinces. Published white paper on cross-border logistics. Beneath that, a letter of recommendation, on thick cream stationery. To whom it may concern. Mr. Rhodes navigates culture like a sailor reads wind. He will make any team both better and braver. Dr. A. Fenwick. Georgetown. Cliff blinked. The script he'd written about Malcolm combusting in silent flame. He turned another page and froze at a scanned email stamped with Silvergate letterhead from 5 years earlier. Subject: internal candidate. M. Rhodes. Final round. The body was short. Strong candidate. Client rapport outstanding. Objection raised by CH refit. Candidate not advanced. There it was again. Sheech. His initials reflected back with archive glare. He felt heat crawl up his neck. Not the clean burn of embarrassment, but a heavier temperature recognition tipping toward danger. Sloane's voice came from somewhere outside the rush in his ears. Anything else you need? Cliff lifted his gaze, composed the mask he knew so well. All good, he said smoothly. Just routine. He closed the folder, fingers a fraction too careful, and slid it back across the desk. On the last page, a stamped note he hadn't noticed before flashed, as it passed the light. External reference: LZ Holdings Vendor Project, 2016, positive feedback. 3 initials annotated the margin. LZ. Cliff's smile held, but his throat tightened. He stood, thanked Sloane, and stepped into the hallway where whispers flickered like fluorescent bulbs, about to fail. For a long beat he didn't move. Then he did, quickly, toward the stairwell, clutching the echo of 2 letters that had just bent his day into a new shape.
LZ.
Legion. And in a heartbeat, Cliff understood that the man he thought he could erase had been written, years ago, into the margins of a name he could not afford to cross. Just as from the end of the corridor, Malcolm turned the corner, and their eyes locked, and both men knew that the next door to open might not be one either of them could close. The hallway seemed narrower than before, the air thick with something unspoken. Cliff still held the aftertaste of those initials, LZ, like metal on the tongue. He'd told himself the resume was a fluke, some glossy artifact of an overinflated self-image, but the folder in HR hadn't lied. Malcolm Rhodes had been a man of rooms Cliff had never entered. Malcolm, meanwhile, had felt the look on Cliff's face in that brief exchange, a flicker of recognition, a sudden rewiring of the hierarchy. Cliff thought immutable. He didn't know what, exactly, the manager had learned, but he knew enough about power to recognize when someone had stumbled over a truth they didn't want to find. That night, after his new midnight shift ended, Malcolm sat in his small Queens apartment, the city's hum leaking through thin walls. He pulled from the bottom drawer a file he hadn't opened in years. Inside lay a life pressed flat. Copies of contracts, boarding passes, handwritten notes in Mandarin, business cards from cities whose street corners he could still smell if he closed his eyes. At the top of the stack, a faded photo him in Beijing, standing beside a conference banner, Sino Global Logistics Summit. He remembered the air in that ballroom, heavy with the scent of polished wood and ambition. He remembered the deal. It had been 2016. He was working for Sino Bridge Advisory, assigned to broker negotiations between a Chinese electronics manufacturer and a mid-cap US distributor. The contract was worth $42 million, a figure that could make or break the year's forecast. Malcolm had been the hinge between cultures, the one who could catch the idioms in Mandarin and translate them into clauses that held under US law. Weeks of 12-hour days, midnight calls, and tea-stained drafts had led to the closing. The night the deal was signed, the CEO had clasped his shoulder. "You've just built us a bridge that will stand for decades," he'd said. Malcolm had smiled then, exhausted but certain that this was the work he was meant to do, making strangers into partners, turning language into trust. 2 weeks later, the press release went out. His name wasn't in it. Instead, a colleague named Richard Vance, white, affable, barely competent, was listed as lead negotiator. The bridge Malcolm had built now had Richard's fingerprints all over it, at least on paper. The congratulations poured in for Richard. A bonus check landed in Richard's account, and when Malcolm questioned the omission, HR replied with a sentence he would never forget. "It's about optics, Malcolm. The client wanted someone who looked like the face of the deal." He had argued. He had documented. He had watched the quiet, well-oiled machinery of corporate self-protection grind his protests into fine dust. Within months, his contract was not renewed. The industry was smaller than it pretended to be. Phone calls went unanswered. Meetings were canceled. Emails politely redirected to junior contacts. Humiliation wasn't a loud thing. It didn't shout. It seeped in, changing the way you walked into rooms, the way you introduced yourself, the way you breathed when people asked what you did. So he had chosen silence. A janitorial job at Silvergate. Steady hours, no travel, anonymity as armor. The mop was lighter than the briefcase in one way. It carried no expectations. For 6 years he had let the dust settle over his name, until Li Zhen walked in. The next morning, Malcolm arrived for his altered shift to find the building different. Not visibly, same lilies, same marble, but there was a hum, a kind of energy that traveled on the breath of conversations he couldn't quite hear. When he passed the executive floor on his way to the supply room, he caught sight of Cliff in the corner of the lounge, talking to 2 partners from HQ. Cliff's gestures were sharp, his expression part caution, part urgency. The moment his gaze brushed Malcolm, his tone shifted, mouth stretching into the corporate smile. "Rhodes," Cliff called, just a bit too loudly. "Step into my office." Inside, the blinds were half closed, slicing the room into bars of light and shadow. Cliff leaned against the desk, arms folded. "You've made an impression," he said. Malcolm waited. "I spoke with Mr. Li this morning," Cliff continued. "He's insistent about something." "What's that?" "That you," Cliff said, "fly to Shanghai. With him. For a major negotiation he's finalizing." The words landed with a weight Malcolm didn't immediately name. He pictured the Bund at night, the river glittering like spilled coins. He pictured the scent of steamed buns on a winter street, the language wrapping around him like a coat he'd once worn daily. Cliff was still speaking. I told him we have protocol, that such trips are reserved for authorized staff, that we can provide a professional translator. He wasn't interested. He says you understand more than the language. You understand him. Malcolm kept his voice level. Do you want me to say no? I want, Cliff said carefully, what's best for the company. And what's best is to avoid unnecessary variables. By variables, Malcolm said, you mean me. Cliff's smile thinned. You'd be leaving your post. We'd have to cover your shifts. It would draw attention. Maybe it already has, Malcolm said. A long pause, during which Cliff's eyes flicked toward the manila folder on his desk. The resume, Malcolm guessed. You've been in rooms before, Cliff said finally. Big rooms. And they didn't keep you. The sentence was designed to find a bruise. Malcolm let it land. Let it test for a reaction. True, he said. But that's the thing about rooms. They're not always built to keep you. Cliff straightened. Mr. Lee leaves in 2 days. If you go, it'll be as his guest. Off the clock. No official representation of Silvergate. Malcolm knew what that meant. No support if things went wrong. No acknowledgement if things went right. The company could wash its hands of him while still benefiting from whatever he achieved. Cliff moved to the door, signaling the conversation's end. Think about it, he said, though his tone suggested he'd already decided what Malcolm should choose. Malcolm stepped back into the hallway. The carpet underfoot felt softer than usual, like the building itself was holding its breath. He could feel the currents shifting. Whispers would become speculation. Speculation would become stories. And stories, once they left the teller's mouth, would never return intact. That night, as he closed the supply closet, his phone buzzed. An unknown international number. Mr. Rhodes, came Li Zhen's voice, warm and deliberate. I've arranged for your travel. You'll have your own suite at the peninsula. My driver will meet you at Pudong Airport. You're sure you want me there? Malcolm asked. Cliff, Li Zhen interrupted gently, is not the bridge I need. Silence pressed between them for a moment, carrying more trust than most contracts. Malcolm had translated. When I was younger, Li Zhen said, I met a man in Guangzhou. He was American, but he understood my city better than many who had lived there all their lives. He showed me how to see my own streets with new eyes. You remind me of him. Malcolm's grip on the phone tightened. What happened to him? He left before the city forgot him, Li Zhen said. Be ready. 2 days. The call ended. Malcolm stood there, phone in hand, the supply closet door still ajar. Somewhere in the building, Cliff was likely drafting an email, tightening the screws on whatever plan he thought would keep the walls intact. But Shanghai was calling, and it wasn't Cliff's voice on the line. From his own office, Cliff watched the glass reflection of Malcolm, walking down the hallway, phone still in hand. On his screen glowed an open message to HQ. Subject, urgent. Shanghai trip, Rhodes contingency plan. His cursor hovered over send. Because if Malcolm was flying to Shanghai, Cliff intended to make sure the landing was anything but smooth. The tarmac wind smelled like kerosene and sea salt, and Malcolm stepped into it with the small, steady stride of someone who'd learned to move through other people's weather. The private terminal sat hushed behind tinted glass, its lounge a museum of quiet money, low Italian sofas, orchids kept forever on the edge of bloom, art books too heavy to open. In the window's reflection he could see himself framed against a Gulfstream's polished fuselage, blue facilities jacket, worn leather duffel, the wrong silhouette in the right place. Cliff stood a few paces behind him, arms folded, jaw ironed flat. He'd come under the pretext of ensuring smooth logistics, but he couldn't disguise the furnace under his suit. The tail number winked in sunlight, as the cabin door lowered like an invitation that wasn't meant for most. A flight attendant in a pearl gray uniform descended, scanning the small group, pilot, Kai pilot, driver, Malcolm with that soft, curated smile private aviation trains into muscle memory. Her gaze paused at the janitor's jacket, and flickered, then resettled into hospitality. Mr. Lee will be aboard momentarily, she said. Mr. Rhodes, welcome. Cliff's head angled. He'll ride commercial, he said smoothly, as if stating the weather. Company policy. Our client is generous, but we can't. A black Mercedes pulled up beside them, like punctuation. Li Zhen stepped out without hurry, winter gray cashmere blazer, over an open collar shirt. He took in the tableau, the jet, the jacket, the man with his arms folded, and smiled the kind of smile that moves furniture without touching it. Good afternoon, he said. Then to Malcolm, in Mandarin, warm as steam from a teacup. You kept your promise. I try to keep the ones that matter, Malcolm answered, the language fitting his mouth the way a familiar song finds the throat. Cliff slid toward them, phone in hand, tone dipped in policy. Mr. Lee, per compliance, guests traveling on private aircraft must be salaried employees or invited by the owner of the aircraft, Lee Jen said, turning the full beam of calm on him. I am the owner. Cliff's smile didn't crack, but it changed temperature. He lifted his phone. Then I'll have to log this as a personal excursion, which means Silvergate assumes no liability for Mr. Rhodes's conduct. Of course, Lee Jen replied. Silvergate has assumed nothing of him for quite some time. He pivoted and his hand light, decisive, swept toward the stair. Malcolm. Malcolm climbed. The carpeted steps gave under his weight like a held breath. Inside, luxury gathered itself into quiet. Cream leather seats, walnut veneer, a bowl of glossy clementines arranged like a still life. A single vase of white peonies breathed out the faintest sweetness. Through a partition he glimpsed a bedroom with a neatly turned down coverlet, a window framing sky. He placed his duffel under a seat he didn't yet feel qualified to crease, and kept his hands still, aware of their size, their history, their long apprenticeship to rooms where touching the wrong thing cost you more than you could afford. The flight attendant appeared with hot towels folded into white squares. Her name tag read Carmen. She offered one to Malcolm with real eyes. Welcome aboard, she said again, softer, as if she meant it this time. Thank you, he said, heat blooming across his palms. He watched the towel steam in the crystal light and thought of cold classrooms in Hunan, where he'd rub his hands together to bring blood back, while chalk dust made galaxies around fluorescent bulbs. Li Shen settled across from him, fastening his belt with the unceremonious click of someone who'd crossed too many oceans to make ritual of it. As the jet pushed back, he leaned forward, elbows easy on his knees. There will be a meal, he said in English for Carmen's benefit, and then I would like to speak for an hour without interruption. After you will sleep. He tilted his head, eyes dancing slightly. Yes, I am giving you orders on a plane I own. Malcolm smiled despite himself. I've heard worse. They climbed through cloud, Manhattan shrinking into a geometry lesson no one could finish. When the seatbelt light winked off, Carmen set down a tray between them. Small bowls of ginger congee, slivers of pickled cucumber, scallion pancakes cut into diamonds, tea that smelled like distant rain. Malcolm tasted the congee and closed his eyes. My landlord in Beijing made this every Sunday, he said in Mandarin, voice lined with a sadness he hadn't planned to show. He said it kept the weak from forgetting him. Li Zhen nodded, satisfied. So you did live there, the way your accent suggests, he replied. Not the way tourists use cities, like vending machines. Malcolm set the spoon down. I taught English. Consulted when people believed I could translate more than words. He paused. Belief is a fragile contract. You are careful with yours, Li Zhen said. I read that in your silence. There was a hum behind the words, something in Li Zhen's tone that suggested the conversation had started long before this jet left the ground. Malcolm kept his face still, but the question rose anyway. You said you arranged this because I remind you of a man you knew in Guangzhou. Li Zhen lifted his cup, watching steam travel upward, as if it were writing. I did say that, he answered, and it is true. He sipped. It is also true that I asked about you before I stepped into Silvergate's lobby. In my country we do not test ice without first measuring the winter. Your name reached me from 2 directions. Malcolm's breath thinned. 2. 1, Li Zhen said, from a logistics director in Shenzhen, who thought the foreign consultant with the quiet eyes understood more than he said. She told me you argued for a penalty clause that protected her workers' hours when the Americans tried to squeeze weekend shifts out of them. That was not in your scope. Malcolm looked at the walnut grain and heard the director's laugh again. It's rough music. Scope, he repeated. People are rarely inside scope. 2. Li Zhen continued, from a teacher in Hunan, who keeps a framed picture of you in her office, the class you guided through verbs and futures. She said you learned her dialect to thank her for soup. You stayed after school to fix a leaky window with the janitor. Malcolm felt heat rise to his eyes and pretended to scratch his brow. He had the tools, he said. I had the time. Li Zhen placed his cup on the tray. To understand a person, follow how they use time. The words should have felt like praise. Instead they settled like responsibility. He swallowed. You also found my resume. I found a trail of doors that closed on you, Li Jun replied, not unkindly. I found an email with initials that matched the man who tried to keep you off this plane. Malcolm didn't look surprised. Some emails don't require translation. A chime sounded, a soft note thin as thread. The cockpit door opened, and the copilot leaned into the cabin. Mr. Lei, he said, we have a message from the FBO. There is a hold on a passenger's clearance. His eyes flicked to Malcolm, and away, embarrassment doing the math. Li Jun's brows drew together. On what grounds? The co-pilot swallowed, a security alert triggered by an employment status discrepancy. The ground marshal wants a copy of the employer authorization for Mr. Rhodes. Cliff, Malcolm thought, like tasting rust. He kept his voice even. Silvergate put me on unpaid leave for the week, he said. They'll argue I'm not traveling in any official capacity. Li Jun's jaw took on a new line. We are 35,000 feet in the air, he said, minimal patience in the cadence. Who is the employer here? You, sir, the co-pilot answered quickly. But the system still pings the last corporate entry. We can clear it if we provide a letter. Li Jun didn't blink. Then send one. He looked to Carmen. Use my letterhead. Mr. Rhodes is traveling at my request as an independent cultural advisor. He turned, including Malcolm in the courtesy of translation. If they require a title to treat you as real, we will give them a title. Titles are costumes. You are not. The co-pilot vanished. The jet held its path, unbothered by the turbulence introduced from the ground. Malcolm sat back, chest loosening, but not entirely. A familiar ache moved under his ribs. How quickly systems made a person conditional. How easily a name could require paperwork to be allowed into the sky. Carmen collected the bowls and refilled their cups. Her bracelets chimed softly. As she leaned, she studied Malcolm's face for a second too long. Were you in Hunan? She asked in Mandarin. Tentative. Malcolm looked up. Years ago. My aunt teaches in Shenyang, she said, smile breaking through professionalism. She sent me a newspaper clipping once. An American helping students prepare for an exchange exam. There was a photo. The man looked like you. It was probably a bad angle, he said, and she laughed, and he felt the cabin tilt toward human again. They spoke for an hour, as Li Jun had decreed. But Malcolm didn't just answer questions. He laid down pieces of himself on the table like objects unpacked after a long trip. Small stories about classrooms and late-night negotiations, about how truth changes shape between languages, and how dignity always sounds the same. If you listen with your hands, Li Jun listened like a man unlearning. It was a rare thing, rarer at altitude. When words thinned into a comfort that didn't need them, Li Jun shifted to the practical. He pulled a slim folder from his briefcase, a thing that looked unremarkable, until Malcolm saw how carefully it was handled. This is tomorrow, Li Jun said. I want you to read everything, mark what stumbles. Malcolm opened the folder and found a concise deck. Background, parties, timeline, risks. The header on the first page wore a logo he knew without wanting to name it. A stylized V, sharp angles, a palette of convincing blue. The letters beneath it arranged themselves into a word his body recognized before his eyes did. Vantage Stratton Global. His mouth went dry, and he turned the page as if by reflex. There it was again, their subsidiary's seal, the layout of the boardroom he had once thought would be his horizon. A footnote referenced a 2016 transaction, Electronics Shenzhen distribution rights. He didn't need to read further to see the old bruise pulsing under new paper. Li Jun was watching him, not unkindly. You know them, he said. It wasn't a question. Malcolm held the folder where it wouldn't shake. A name surfaced like something dark rising from depth. Robert Vale. Another edged in, Richard Vance. He saw a press release without his name, and an HR email with the word optics, pasted over truth like a bandage that never adhered. I do, he said quietly. Li Jun considered this, then nodded once. The slow, grave assent of a man who didn't flinch from bad weather. Then you also know why I wanted you. They will speak 2 languages tomorrow, one on the page, one under the table. I need both translated. Malcolm turned another page. A headshot smiled up from the counterparty team slide. Silver hair, tie knotted like a threat. Under it the caption Senior VP, Global Partnerships, R. Vale. The cabin seemed to narrow until it was a throat. He set the folder down with the care you give a fragile object that has already cracked inside. His pulse found his wrists. Somewhere forward, the engines sang their endless note. "Robert," he said aloud, the name tasting like smoke. "You left that room once," Lejeune said. "You do not have to enter it for me." Malcolm stared at the window where night had spread like ink. His reflection looked back, older than the man in the press release, steadier than the man they'd erased. He could decline. He could land in Shanghai, turn left instead of right, disappear into steaming bowls of noodle soup, and a street where his name meant nothing and everything. But the folder lay open, and there are some doors you do not walk around without carrying them for the rest of your life. He drew breath. "I'll go," he said. "I'll translate everything." Lejeune's chin dipped. "Good. Then gentler. Eat fruit. It helps with the dryness." He pushed the bowl of clementines forward, and the domesticity made the room human again. Carmen reappeared with a warm towel and fresh tea. The co-pilot followed, offering a paper for signature. "Clearance resolved," he said, grateful. "We're good with ATC." "Thank you," Lejeune said. Then to Malcolm, "Sleep. We cross time tonight." Malcolm nodded and stood. The cabin's small bedroom waited, quiet as a held hand. He set the folder on the bedside table where his eyes would find it first, in the morning. He loosened his shoes and stretched out under a blanket that smelled faintly of laundry and sky. The aircraft shivered as it touched a cold stream of air, then steadied. He closed his eyes and saw a boardroom half a world away. Men in suits ruffling papers, a laugh that didn't reach the eyes, a pen signing away a name. Sleep came in shards. When it finally unspooled, it pulled him into a dream where chalk dust fell like snow and a headline scrolled across the sky. "Urgent. HR action on Rhodes. Became urgent. R. Vale." In Shanghai, he woke with his heart in his mouth, sat up, and looked straight at the folder's open page, where the logo's blue cut into the dark. He reached out to close it, and his hand paused, because tucked in the binding was a second card he hadn't seen. A simple rectangle of cream paper embossed with a single line in Mandarin. He angled it toward the light, and read, "Trust is the quiet between words." He could not tell if it was a warning or a promise. Either way, morning would ask him to answer it. And as the jet carved the invisible arc between past and tomorrow, Malcolm realized that the meeting in Shanghai wasn't just with a corporation. It was with the men who had taught him what a name was worth. Morning slid across Shanghai like a silk ribbon, and the city answered with traffic, steam, and the quiet impatience of commerce. Malcolm followed Lejeune through the lobby of a tower that rose out of Pudong like a metronome. Glass doors parted, the elevator breathed them upward, and the conference floor delivered its curated chill carpet so dense it swallowed footsteps, a view that made the river look disciplined. He felt the folder in his arm like a pulse. The boardroom door stood open, the table already ringed by men and a few women whose confidence had been drenched into their collars. Nameplates gleamed beside bottles of imported water and pens laid with military precision. At the far end, framed by a sheet of glass that refused to look like a wall, sat a profile Malcolm knew in the cartilage. The jaw, the silver hair combed into obedience, the relaxed shoulder of a man who believed rooms worked for him. Robert Vale turned, and the past snapped taut. The recognition hit Malcolm's body first. A flinch at the edge of breath, an ache where memory stores its old fever. Robert's eyes skimmed the newcomers. He looked straight at Malcolm, and something deliberate happened. A blink that became a sifting, then a blandness that pretended there was nothing to find. The performance was as practiced as a handshake. He gave Malcolm all the courtesy of a stranger. Lejeune's presence altered the room's gravity. Polite smiles recalibrated into attention. A junior assistant stepped forward with hovering grace. "Mr. Li," she said in Mandarin, "welcome. We've prepared tea." Her gaze flicked to Malcolm, curious, respectful before settling back into protocol. Robert rose at last, the smile designed for cameras. "Mr. Li," he said in English, "a pleasure." Robert Vale. His handshake was a sculpted thing. He inclined his head at Malcolm's periphery. "And your associate?" "Malcolm Rhodes," Lejeune answered, gentle but unmissable. "He is my voice today." Robert's eyes clicked like a camera shutter. Still, the blankness remained. "Of course," he said. "Welcome." Chairs drew back. Fabric whispered. Malcolm took the seat at Lejeune's right. The same geography as in Manhattan. But the air here smelled different. Steel and river, and something else, the old promise he'd once made to himself about the man across the table. He placed the folder down, kept his hands open, and tried to convince his pulse that time is a circle only if you walk it. The presentations began with the choreography of corporate courtship. Vantage Stratton's team toggled slides that turned risk into architecture. Numbers marched. A young woman from compliance traced a contour of covenants with the precision of lace. Malcolm translated Li Zhan's questions into the firm English of an investor who had built empires from patience. He could feel Robert's gaze slide along the edges of his voice like a test for cracks. When the first pause arrived, Robert leaned back, casual. "Mr. Li, your interest in our logistics corridor aligns beautifully with our America's growth strategy. We've admired your discipline for years." He let the compliment hover, then angled it. "To be candid, we're relieved to have you at the table rather than others." Malcolm heard the unsaid name, competitors from Shenzhen, a state-backed fund in Guangzhou. He carried the sentence to Mandarin without its residue of superiority, washing it into something clean. Li Zhen replied with a polite nod. "Admiration is easy," he said. "Integration is harder." "Then let's make it easy," Robert answered, smile returning to showroom brightness. "Our proposed control clause, governance," Malcolm said smoothly, redirecting the word as he had in Manhattan. "Co-stewardship with defined lanes." Robert's attention finally pinned him. The charm dialed down a degree, the eyes sharpened. "And you are Mr. Rhodes? Remind me of your background." It was an old trick, force a man to justify standing. Malcolm kept his tone neutral. "Cross-border advisory, education initiatives in Hunan, prior work in Shenzhen, on distribution frameworks." Robert's jaw clicked, a small sound. He said, as though retrieving a faint, unimportant memory. "We do see quite a few consultants." Lejean's head turned. The room shifted by a few invisible centimeters. "Mr. Rhodes is not a consultant," he said in English, slow enough to land without wobble. "He is the difference between misunderstanding and respect." Something like color touched Robert's cheekbones. He smiled past it. "Then we're in capable hands," he said, and pointed his pen at the next slide. Malcolm translated the next sequence with a precision he had honed in kitchens, classrooms, and rooms where his name had been mispronounced while his work was called someone else's. As Vantage Stratton proposed a cash-first close with a deferred earnout, he rendered it in Mandarin with the cultural caution it required, framing the deferral not as a leash but as an instrument for harmony. He turned their indemnity schedule into sentences that breathed. He resisted the urge to sand down the barbs entirely. Li Zhen liked his truth with a little thorn. Halfway through, an unexpected tremor entered the air, not from the river's wind, but from the far side of the table. A junior analyst with a nervous pen had broken his stillness to whisper to the woman beside him. She glanced up, startled, and her eyes filled with recognition so sudden it almost spilled. When the floor passed to her for a regulatory update, she steadied herself and spoke in clear Mandarin that carried the lilt of Hunan. "Mr. Le," she said, "local approvals will follow the joint venture filing. We've pre-cleared with zone officials." Her gaze flickered to Malcolm for a second. That felt like a door opening on a remembered kitchen. After the slide, she risked a sentence in their shared dialect. Quiet as rain. "Teacher, is it you?" Malcolm felt the word break him open. He turned his head fractionally. "Lena?" he answered, just loud enough to count as air. She was grown now, hair pinned, blazer immaculate. But her eyes were the same ones that had once labored over English vowels while he drew little boats on the board to carry each sound across. She pressed her lips together to imprison a smile and return to professional cadence. But the room had changed again. Not for everyone, but for him. The past had arrived not as a ghost to haunt, but as a witness. Robert saw the exchange without comprehending it, and allowed a displeased micro-expression to pass across his face like a cloud. They broke for tea. Porcelain side onto saucers. Executives stood as though their bodies were contracts too. Robert drifted toward the window with the natural laziness of men who expect movement to accommodate them. Malcolm lingered by the thermos, pouring for Li Zhen with care. Steam wrote ideograms that vanished. "Small world," Li Zhen murmured in Mandarin, eyes following Lena, as she consulted quietly with her team. "Big world," Malcolm replied. "People make it small." Robert joined them, carrying the river in his stance. "Mr. Li," he said off the record, "you're making a wise choice moving with us. We protect our partners." He indulged a glance at Malcolm, "and we hire the best people for the right roles." The sentence's sugar masked a past toxin. Malcolm kept his face calm. He remembered the email. Optics. He remembered the press release that had deleted him like a typo. Li Zhen's response was a kindness honed to an edge. Protection that requires me to forget who I am is not protection, he said softly. He shifted his cup toward Malcolm, a silent request for translation he didn't need, an honor disguised as habit. When they reconvened, the weather in the room had cooled a degree. Robert brought up the non-compete carve-outs, with a confidence that suggested inevitability. He tried a conciliation. In practice, we rarely enforce these aggressively. Malcolm translated the line exactly, then added, in Mandarin, the context Li Zhen would have guessed anyway. They reserve the right to squeeze if returns sag. Lol Zhen nodded once. Then write what you practice, he said. Silence pressed around the table, the kind that has money inside it. Robert's smile thinned. We can consider language, he said, but we'll need something in return. A small, satisfied click of a pen came from Brent Coe's counterpart on their side. A man with clever eyes who enjoyed trades too much. Malcolm breathed, and prepared to balance knives. That was when Robert tried a different weapon. He leaned forward, elbows near the paper, and lowered his voice by a fraction. Mr. Li, he said, trust is delicate. I understand you've brought community-minded advisors to rooms before, and it complicates decisive action. We can simplify this. Our team and yours, no intermediaries. For 3 heartbeats, no one moved. The word community-minded hung there, coded as soft, unserious, a euphemism for people who didn't belong in the center of things. Malcolm felt the sentence ring the old bell in his chest, the one tuned to humiliation and dismissal. Rage warmed his fingertips, fear traced his spine, restraint held both by the collar. He met Robert's eyes, finally directly. Would you like me to translate that, he asked, tone even. Robert's smile held. If you think it will help. Malcolm turned to Li Zhen and gave him the sentence unvarnished in Mandarin, including the contempt stitched into community-minded. He did not add an adjective. He did not subtract one. He simply refused to let the insult hide. Li Zhen set his pen down, with surgical care. He turned to the window, watched a barge move like resolve across the river, then laid a hand flat on the paper in front of him, and spoke with the quiet of a man, removing a glove, before striking. Miss Vale, he said in English now, so that there would be no dispute about what was heard. Mr. Rhodes is not an intermediary. He paused. He is the reason I am in this room. A fissure moved under Robert's cheek. For half a second, some honest, uncamouflaged recognition broke through the performance. Startle, perhaps even memory. It vanished fast, replaced by a shrug so elegant it almost rose to grace. Then we're aligned, he said lightly. Shall we talk price? They did, line by cautious line. Malcolm found a rhythm in the storm. Catch the clause, open its ribs, show where it could breathe. When Lena spoke on a licensing nuance, he watched her hands calm, exact, and felt a quiet anchoring pride that did not ask permission to exist. Robert sardined compromises into smiles. Li Zhen harvested them without gloating. A draft architecture emerged, co-chaired governance, mutual audits, a narrowed non-compete, a seasonality clause Malcolm had insisted on because markets do not run like clocks. As the hour stretched into 2, exhaustion and adrenaline braided, climate control hummed, the river kept its own counsel, and the city outside moved on with or without them. In a brief lull, Li Zhen leaned toward Malcolm and asked in Mandarin, Lo, can you carry us the rest of the way? Malcolm thought of the email subject line that had tried to define him, of the shift change that sought to erase him, of the kitchen in Hunan, where a young woman learned futures and then grew into one. He thought of a press release that had removed his name, and a plane that had required a letter to admit his existence into the sky. Yes, he said. Li Zhen nodded once. Decision made, weather set. He turned to the table and placed his palm gently on the dossier. We will proceed, he said, on one condition. Robert's pen stopped mid-note. Name it. Li Zhen stood, and the act of standing changed the room's architecture. Power rearranged itself around posture. He glanced at the glass behind Robert, at the city reflected there, like a witness, then stepped aside from the head of the table, leaving a clear axis where authority had been. From here, he said, voice even, carrying undeniable, Malcolm will lead the negotiation. The boardroom air tightened the moment Li Zhen stepped aside. The head of the table, the symbolic crown of the meeting, was now empty, a vacancy that seemed to tilt the room toward Malcolm. He walked into that space without rushing, every step measured, letting the silence stretch just enough to remind everyone it was no accident. He was standing there. Across from him, Robert Vale's pen tapped twice before going still. His smile didn't change, but his eyes had acquired a watchfulness that wasn't there before. Beside him, two Vantage Stratton executives leaned toward each other, murmuring in Mandarin, too low for the official record, just loud enough for the person they thought couldn't understand. He looks like facility staff. This is who's leading, one said, lips curling around the disbelief. The other chuckled under his breath. Maybe Lijian brought him for diversity optics. Westerners love that. A ripple of laughter spread to the far end of the table, muffled behind hands. Malcolm didn't move, didn't flinch. If they thought they were speaking into a sealed jar, he would let them, right up until he broke it open. Lijian's gaze flicked to Malcolm, the faintest question in his eyes. Malcolm gave the smallest nod. He was fine, more than fine. Let's begin, Malcolm said in Mandarin. Not the stilted formal register of a textbook, but the lived-in cadence of a man who had shared hot pot in back alleys and debated supply chain routes over tea at midnight. The shift was immediate. The Vantage Stratton team froze, the weight of what they had just said hanging suddenly in the open air. He didn't acknowledge the insults. Not yet. Instead, he began dismantling their proposal clause by clause. You've set an aggressive production ramp for Q2, he said. But your seasonal analysis assumes stable port operations. Last year, typhoon delays cost carriers 3 days on average. That's 3 days of aging inventory in tropical humidity. Have you factored the shrinkage risk? The junior analyst on their side shuffled papers, caught off guard. Our models are based on 2020 data, Malcolm interrupted, sliding a printed chart toward them. Outdated, and 2020 didn't have the port labor strikes you'll see this year. Robert's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Malcolm pressed on. He reframed their non-compete clause, not as a threat but as a loyalty agreement, mutual enforceable, and tied to milestone achievements, rather than blanket restrictions. He used idioms when they made a point sharper, analogies when the table's energy flagged. At one point, when they tried to dodge on environmental compliance costs, he leaned back and delivered an old Chinese proverb in flawless tone. You can paint the surface of the river, but the fish will still see the truth beneath. Lijian smiled at that one. Robert did not. As the negotiation deepened, Malcolm began subtly reshaping the room, where their finance had pushed for higher penalties on delivery delays. Malcolm countered by offering a tiered penalty system, less punitive, but structured to reward early completion. Punishment motivates compliance, he said, but reward motivates excellence. Which one do you want in your supply chain? It wasn't just language. It was the ability to braid economics with dignity, to make every point sound like a shared victory, rather than a concession. By the third hour, even the executives who had smirked at him were leaning forward, pens still, watching him more than Lijian. And all the while he remembered their first whispered joke. Diversity optics. He was showing them the one thing they couldn't mimic. Fluency not just in words but in respect. The pivotal moment came when Robert tried to spring an 11th hour addition, a right of first refusal clause on any of Lijian's future acquisitions in the Americas. Purely procedural, Robert said. All smooth assurance. It just ensures alignment. Malcolm translated it plainly to Lijian. No spin, no softening. Then he leaned in, his Mandarin turning from conversational to surgical. This clause would give them control over deals you haven't even imagined yet. It's not alignment, it's a leash. Lijian's brows lifted. Then cut the leash, he said simply. Malcolm turned back to Robert. We're removing that clause. It doesn't serve both sides. Robert's pen clicked. Mr. Rhodes, with all due respect, that clause is gone, Malcolm said, tone still calm but carrying the kind of finality that doesn't invite negotiation. Silence. Then surprisingly, Robert nodded once. Fine. Let's talk numbers. When the final figures were read aloud, they weren't just good, they were extraordinary. Lijian had secured not only the original terms he'd wanted, but also a profit-sharing mechanism on certain high-margin product lines, worth an estimated additional $200 million annually. By the time the agreement was printed and initialed, the total projected value had crossed the billion-dollar mark. A deal this size was the kind that made careers, rewrote reputations, and got whispered about in industry circles for years. Lijian signed last. He set the pen down, looked across the table at Malcolm, and gave the smallest of nods. The Vantage Stratton team, rose for the ceremonial handshake. Cameras were discreetly raised by assistants. This was the image that would travel the fastest. Men in suits sealing the deal. Robert stepped forward first, hand outstretched, the polished smile firmly in place. Malcolm looked at it for a beat too long. Then he met Robert's eyes, steady, unreadable, and did not take the hand. "Mr. Vale," he said in English, his voice polite enough to cut glass. "This agreement is between LZ Holdings and Vantage Stratton. I am not a party to it." Robert's smile wavered for the first time all day. His hand dropped. The room felt the shift, subtle but seismic. Malcolm turned to Li Zhen, gave a small bow of respect, and stepped back from the table. The cameras still clicked, but the picture they caught wasn't the one anyone had expected. As the assistants gathered papers, Lena discreetly slipped Malcolm a folded note. No words, just a logo, one he hadn't seen in years, from the firm that had once promised to back him before vanishing during his fall. Beneath it, a time, midnight. The Bund. Malcolm looked up to find her already gone. And when he glanced across the table, Robert Vale was watching him with an expression Malcolm hadn't seen before. Something that looked a lot like concern. The photograph that traveled first wasn't the official one. It was a grainy, off-center shot taken on someone's phone from the back of the Shanghai boardroom. No perfect angles, no corporate lighting, just a moment caught while breath was still settling after ink met paper. It showed Li Zhen standing a half step behind Malcolm, hand lifted mid-gesture. The space between them electric with something that looked like respect. At the edge of the frame, Robert Vale's outstretched hand hung alone, unshaken. By dusk in Shanghai and early morning in New York, the caption had hardened into a headline on Chinese social platforms. "Black Janitor Leads Billion-Dollar Deal." The phrasing was both true and not accurate to the humiliation he'd swallowed, and the room he'd just commanded, reductive to the decades between. Within an hour, the story crossed languages like a rumor wearing new shoes. U.S. finance blogs lifted the line whole. Cable producers added heat for breakfast TV. Clips of Malcolm speaking Mandarin, 2 seconds here, 5 seconds there, stitched from phones and memories, circulated with subtitles that didn't always deserve the name. Back at Silvergate, receptionists arrived to messages blinking red. Assistants whispered over phone cups. Someone printed the headline and taped it to the break room refrigerator, and someone else peeled it off with 2 fingers as if it might smear. Cliff walked into the lobby at 7:58 a.m. Sleep stripped from his face and replaced by that polished alertness executives wore to funerals and product launches. The lilies still trumpeted their imported innocence. The marble floor was still an argument for permanence. But the room's temperature had changed. The guard nodded too carefully. The receptionist's smile landed an inch to the left of normal. He didn't sit. He didn't order coffee. He went straight to PR. Silvergate's communication suite glowed the color of clean teeth, white walls, bright screens, standing desks. A large monitor pulled in headlines from east and west, blue bars of sentiment analysis crawling like stock tickers across the bottom. The director of PR, a woman named Camila, with a voice that soft-pedaled urgency into something you could mistake for choice, waved him in. "We're monitoring," she said. "It's moving." Cliff tilted his chin at the wall of headlines. "Kill it." Camila's smile held. "It's not that kind of fire." A junior staffer tapped her keyboard. "Here." She pulled up a Chinese post over 300,000 shares and translated on the fly. "Student says she recognized him from her village school, calls him the teacher who stayed after the bell, mentions he spoke the local dialect." Cliff's eyes narrowed. "Is there video?" "2 short clips," the junior answered. "No audio on the insult, just him correcting a clause in Mandarin. Then Mr. Li saying something about trust. It's clean," Cliff repeated, then pivoted. "Our statement." Camila had one ready, of course. She read, "Silvergate congratulates all parties on a successful cross-border partnership. Our team values the contributions of employees across the organization and remains committed to excellence." She looked up. "We feature you as the branch lead liaising with the client." Cliff felt the relief travel his spine. "Good. Keep it general. No names." Camila hesitated. "The client named a name," she said gently. Mr. Li posted a photo tagging 8 Rhodes on his Chinese microblog. It's trending under a hashtag that roughly translates to the language of dignity. She checked her screen, and a flight attendant from Li's jet posted a cheerful snap of him and Mr. Rhodes eating congee. "It's wholesome. It validates everything." Cliff's jaw made a small, invisible movement. like a man chewing gravel and calling it bread. Draft something with my signature. Praise Mr. Lee. De-emphasize the staff. The staffer has a name, Camila said. Patience trimmed to the seam. Cliff didn't blink. We'll decide when to use it. He left PR to do what PR could, marched to his office, and lit up his inbox like a runway. There were messages from HQ Legal, from Risk, from an executive vice president who loved the word optics, the way some men loved their first cars. There was also an email from Vantage Stratton's corporate communications, subject alignment on narrative, that invited Silvergate to synchronize messaging for external stakeholders, which meant tell the story our way. Cliff clicked it open and read carefully. Vantage Stratton's draft congratulated our longtime partner Silvergate and praised managerial leadership on both sides, but it did not mention Malcolm. It did, however, include a photo from a different angle, one where Cliff standing off to the side in Shanghai could be mistaken for an integral part of the conversation, rather than a man watching a center of gravity realign without him. He hit reply. Approved. He did not notice yet the email lower in the scroll. From R. Vale, with an attachment named SH Conference Room CCTV. .wuv, and a one-line note thought you'd want to be prepared. Your house isn't in order. By mid-morning, Li Zhen's Chinese post had crossed oceans. Financial Twitter vibrated with hot takes. Diversity dividends in action. Janitor out-negotiates Ivy MBAs. When gatekeeping fails. The comments were not kind in equal measure. Some celebrated. Some patronized. Some asked if he'd really been a janitor or if this was a carefully staged brand event. Others slid into the familiar ditch. If he's that good, why was he mopping floors? A reply answered, because floors are easier to clean than buy it. In the facility's locker room, Raina watched the posts with her mouth half open. They're talking about you, she said, when Malcolm's call came through from a number stamped with an international code. Her voice was equal parts pride and worry. You okay? I'm still in Shanghai, Malcolm said, watching the city through a hotel window that made it look like a painting you weren't supposed to touch. Okay is a moving target. Cliff's out here sharpening scissors, Raina said. PR's got a statement, but his face looks like a mask that doesn't fit. Malcolm exhaled. Don't get cut. I keep my hands, even when boys play with knives, she said. Then softer, be careful. He promised. What he could. Down the hall, Li Zhen was already dressed for the next day. Silk tie the color of a storm that decides to hold its rain. Over tea he commented on the coverage without triumph. Narratives run like rivers, he said in Mandarin. If you pretend to dam them with your hands, they drown you out of spite. They're calling me the janitor who saved a deal, Malcolm said. It's not wrong. It's also not the whole. Nothing that travels fast is whole, Li Zhen replied. Do you want to correct them? Malcolm thought of the kids in Hunan. Lena's eyes lighting like someone brought her a piece of a future she'd once only seen at a distance. He thought of the morning shifts, the mop's quiet monotony that had asked nothing of his pride. He thought of Cliff's initials on an old memo, the press release that removed his name, the outstretched hand he had refused. I want the work to be the correction, he said. Li Zhen nodded once. Then do the next right work. By lunchtime in New York, Camila's official statement went live. Every comma had been litigated. It congratulated the parties, used the word team 3 times, and did not mention Malcolm by name. In some quarters it worked. In others it backfired. A tech columnist quote tweeted it with, "Imagine rewriting a story about talent so hard you edit out the talent." Underneath, screenshots multiplied. The Shanghai photo, Carmen's flight selfie, a student's dorm room post, with a picture of her and Malcolm from years ago. Him at a blackboard, chalk on his knuckles, a window open to fog. Cliff watched this unfurl and told himself with the discipline of someone who has traded truth for strategy before, that outrage has the lifespan of a fruit fly. He decided to starve it. He booked a 3 p.m. with legal. They were waiting for him. 3 lawyers in varying shades of caution. The most senior, a compact woman named Perul, whose earrings always matched the day's risk level, slid a folder across the table. We need to talk about exposure, she said. If the narrative cements that Malcolm led a deal without formal authority, and if any of our partners feel misrepresented, our partner, Cliff interrupted. Mr. Lee insisted on it. Clients insist on many things, Perul said calmly. We shield the firm. Right now, our shield has a Malcolm-shaped hole. Cliff spread his hands. Then help me patch it. Policy is your patch, Perul replied. unauthorized external representation, conflict of interest, travel on a client's aircraft without written disclosure. She paused. We will need to take action. He felt the old alloy of relief and dread. Relief at having a lever, dread at what pulling it would yank into view. We'll proceed, he said, quietly. Perul didn't look convinced it would be quiet. The more public the story, the quieter we must be in process, she said. But the process must still happen. They moved to H. Sloane Mercer kept her bowl of stress balls front and center today, as if color might have weight. Her voice was the one she used for layoffs and lawsuits. A middle register that promised nothing except that you were being heard while the decision happened elsewhere. We're receiving inquiries, she said, tapping a sheet. Media Alumni Associations, a trade publication that wants to profile our hidden linguist. We have to centralize responses. Centralize him, Cliff said coolly. We need to put this back in the drawer it came from. Sloane opened a second folder. It was thinner than the manila one Cliff had read the day before, but its contents were sharper. There's also this, she said. An internal person. Anonymous. Forward a screenshot. She slid it across. On the page was the subject line that had first flashed in the boardroom. Urgent. HR action on Rhodes. The timestamp aligned too neatly with the moment Malcolm had been invited to dinner. Cliff stared. Who has access to this? 2 assistants and legal intake, Sloane said. But the question is not who sent it, it's who might see it if it leaks. Then don't let it leak, he said. Sloane's look said grown men should know which sentences are not instructions, but wish it. While the firm wrestled its shadow, the outside world grew a spine. On a Mandarin language forum, a thread started by Lena bloomed into a long braided testimony. A teacher who stayed after hours, who brought dumplings to class on exam days, who sat with the janitor to fix a window because cold makes learning sting. The thread had dozens of replies from other alumni, people who had moved to cities and carried their dialect like a plant in a new apartment, watering it on weekends. Their words were not about a deal. They were about a man. In parallel, a U.S. business magazine published a short digital piece, quick turn, under-edited, suggesting that an internal campaign to sideline Rhodes predated the Shanghai trip. They had no proof, but they had a voice memo from a source who sounded a lot like someone who used to work the facility's night shift. They changed his hours the day he spoke in the lobby. They took his name out of the directory. By late afternoon, the switchboard at Silvergate was lit like a runway again. Camila's team took calls with the cool of people playing chess with water on a ship. Cliff stood at the window of his office watching the city swallow narratives the way it swallowed weather. First as novelty, then as background, then as something indistinguishable from itself. His phone buzzed. An unknown number. He answered. Cliff, Robert Vale said, his voice honeyed and tired. Quite a storm you've got. Cliff's smile cut in on reflex. Robert, congratulations. A great outcome for all. For most, Robert corrected. He sounded almost bored, which meant he had already chosen his angle. Look, your man is talented, but talent without a leash can walk itself into trouble. You ought to get ahead of that. Cliff let the implication marinate. Our internal processes are underway. Robert hummed. Then we're aligned. We'll say the right things publicly. We always do. Privately, though, clean up your house. The line clicked dead. It took a full 5 seconds for Cliff to remember the earlier email from Robert he'd ignored. He searched, found it, opened the attachment. The CCTV clip showed the Shanghai boardroom men laughing behind hands. The Mandarin insult crawling like oil through the air. The file ended with Malcolm's voice landing in their language like a sentence that would outlive them. Cliff closed the laptop gently, as if it might break louder than he wanted. He didn't go to PR. He didn't go to legal. He went to his inbox, where a new message from HQ had arrived, with the subject line that finished the floor's murmurs, starred and flagged by the assistant, who knew where stories end, when men like Cliff are required to write the last line. Subjectic. Immediate directive. Rhodes employment status. From EVP, North America. Body remove Rhodes from all client-facing contexts before he causes more trouble. Terminate or reassign at your discretion. Do not allow him near Ligen again. Report back by EOD. Cliff read it twice. The word remove ringing like a fire alarm. He'd been waiting to hear. His thumb hovered over forward. He hesitated, calculating every path. Then he typed 2 words to HR. Proceed, quietly. And as he hit send, the office lights flickered, the grid performing its daily reset. While halfway around the world, a man who had just saved $1 billion checked his phone and saw an email arrive from Silvergate Facilities. with a subject line that was not a question, and not quite an answer. Meeting request. Employment review. Mandatory. The city paused on its inhale, and the ocean between them did not blink. The email subject line blinked at him from the hotel desk, like a small red eye. Meeting request, employment review. Mandatory. Malcolm read it twice, then a third time as if repetition might soften the edges. Outside, Shanghai's late light laid a sheen over the river. Inside, the air felt airless. At the appointed hour, his screen filled with boxes. Sloan from HR in one, legal in another. Cliff centered like a judge, who'd picked his verdict on the way to court. Sloan's voice arrived first. Precise, professional. Thank you for joining, Mr. Rhodes. We'll keep this official. Cliff leaned toward his camera. Malcolm, this is routine. We just need clarity on a few discrepancies. Which discrepancies? Malcolm asked. A lawyer in a gray suit consulted a sheet. Several. Unauthorized representation at a client meeting. Travel on a client's aircraft without prior written disclosure. And a matter of confidential documents, removal and possession of internal HR memos. There's also an allegation of insubordination regarding managerial direction to decline certain duties. The last clause found its mark. Malcolm remembered the photocopy in his locker. The old memo stamped limited cultural fit and initialed CH. It had appeared anonymously. Now, like a trap sprung shut, it appeared on legal's list as if Malcolm had fished it out himself. I did not take any document from HR, he said, voice steady. A copy was placed in my locker. Sloane's expression pursed into sympathy that asked to be believed. We have time-stamped printer logs. The copy in your locker contains a traceable watermark unique to HR's machine. There is surveillance video of someone in a facilities jacket near the HR floor after hours. I was moved to the late shift that day, Malcolm said. By Cliff. Cliff's smile was stone-dressed as skin. Shifts were adjusted for coverage. You know that. Legal raised a palm, cooling, containing. We're not here to adjudicate intent. We're here to protect the firm. Malcolm's mouth opened, then closed. He could feel the old sensation under his ribs, the one that had visited him in 2016, when a press release had erased his name. It wasn't anger first. It was a kind of hollowness, like someone had knocked on his chest and found echo. Sloan continued, voice flattening the meaning out of words. Given the profile of recent events, we're placing you on administrative leave, pending outcome of our review. Your building access will be paused. Please return any company property when you're back in New York. Paused, Malcolm repeated softly, as if the right synonym might make it less permanent. You're sidelining me in the middle of the story you're telling about me. We value your service, Sloan said, the phrase machine-stitched. But process must be followed. Cliff glanced at his watch. We'll be in touch. The call ended without sound. For a long minute, Malcolm sat still. His own breath sounded like traffic underwater. Then his phone lit with a name that steadied him. Raina. I saw the notice, she said. Security just boxed your locker. Cliff told facilities you were on leave. No return date. They're calling it a review, Malcolm said. A review is what people call a verdict when they haven't told you, she answered. Then softer. There's a rumor you stole an HR doc. He closed his eyes. Sloan said they have printer logs. Logs can be educated, she said. Do you want me to ask around? Not yet, he said. He didn't want her cut by a blade meant for him. Keep your hands. A vibration rattled the desk. A message from Carmen, the flight attendant, in gentle Mandarin. Saw the news. Hold your ground. The sky doesn't ask permission to be sky. He read it twice, grateful for the plainness. By afternoon, the story mutated. Headlines learned to hiss. Janitor hijacks client meeting. Flies private on billionaire's jet. Silvergate staffer under review for ethics breach. Former consultant, has history of contract non-renewal. Blogs threaded innuendo through old facts with the skill of men who sold curiosity as truth. A host on a morning show asked whether it was appropriate for support staff to be influencing decisions of this magnitude. An op-ed posed the question with white gloves. Is merit clouded by representation politics? Between the noise, other currents flowed. Lena's alumni thread kept blooming. Photographs of a chalk-dusted teacher, stories written like lanterns. A short clip leaked of executives at Vantage Stratton chuckling in Mandarin about diversity optics, and a quiet majority recognized venom, even when it wore a suit. But outrage and grace ran on different clocks. Corporate process needed only one. Near dusk, Lai Zhen called. He gave no small talk. I assume they placed you on leave, he said.
They did.
On what grounds? The shape keeps changing, Malcolm said. Authorizar's representation. A memo I didn't take. A plane I did. Li Zhen's silence had texture. When someone wants to break a bowl, they start by pointing at the cracks they drew, he said. This is how institutions unhear a voice. He paused. Do you still want dinner? Tonight. I will not hide, Malcolm said quietly. They met at a small restaurant, whose entry lantern pooled light onto the lane, like honey. Inside, a back room had been arranged with privacy that didn't smell like secrecy. Steam from clay pots made the air soft. Li Zhen gestured for Malcolm to sit and poured tea himself, a gesture he did not outsource. They will try to make you choose shame, Li Zhen said. Don't. I'm tired of being a study in resilience, Malcolm said, a half smile that didn't hold. Li Zhen folded his hands. Then let's talk about what is not them. He took out a thin portfolio, the same cream paper that had carried invoices and destinies all week, and slid it across the table. This is a proposal, not a pity. A job. Malcolm didn't touch it yet. You should know what they'll call it if I accept. Optics. Token. The man the billionaire saved. I do not save men, Li Zhen said. I build with them. Read. Inside the folder lay a title that felt both unfamiliar and correctly sized. Director, Cultural Strategy and Stewardship, LZ Holdings, Global. The description was not about translating words. It was about translating systems, designing contracts that held dignity as a line item, building teams that could hear each other without a middleman. Compensation sat like an afterthought, generous enough to be shocking if the rest hadn't been larger. Malcolm breathed out. You knew they would do this. I didn't know timing, Li Zhen said. But I know men, the ones who fear losing authority, always mistake respect for rebellion. Cliff set the board, Malcolm said. Robert handed him the pieces. Li Zhen's eyes sharpened. Robert sent me a note, he said. It read, Control your janitor. He will not enjoy the next chapters. Malcolm looked up. He wrote that to you? He wrote it to a version of me he prefers, Li Zhen said. I keep copies of men's imaginations. They ate, and the meal measured time rather than filled it. Between bites, the unexpected arrived. Malcolm's phone lit with an unknown number, a reporter from the business magazine that had floated the sidelining thesis. Her voice carried the pretense of neutrality. We're publishing a piece on your unusual ascent. Do you have comment on allegations that you appropriated an internal HR document? No, Malcolm said. I have a question for you. Why is the verb never applied to the people who take contributions and call them theirs? The pause told him the quote would run. He ended the call and felt the coil tighten. Another notch. He had never been good at furnishing the story people wanted. He was even worse at furnishing the lie they preferred. When dessert arrived, a small bowl of sweet black sesame soup that tasted like the childhood he didn't have, Li Zhen spoke again. I won't ask you to decide tonight, he said, but I will ask you to decide without revenge as a spice. It sours the dish. If I say yes, Malcolm said, Cliff will call it proof. If I say no, he'll call it admission. Either way, Li Zhen replied, he will call it something. Men like him are namers. The question is, what do you call it? Malcolm didn't answer. He was thinking of the locker box being taped shut, of security badges, deactivated by keystrokes that didn't even warm a finger. He was thinking of Lena's note, midnight, the bund, and the way some invitations are bridges, not traps. He was thinking of the moment in the boardroom when he refused to shake a hand and the tremor that traveled through the room because a black man had decided not to make a picture easier to print. He closed the portfolio and rested his palm on it, as if to feel whether the paper had a heartbeat. What if I'm tired of rooms where my presence is a negotiation before the negotiation? Then build different rooms, Li Zhen said, with different doors. The city hummed through the walls, the traffic's patience, the river's insistence. Malcolm felt something like a future tilt toward him, not with fireworks, but with gravity. Another message arrived on his phone. This one not from media or facilities, but from an address he hadn't seen in years. Richard Vance. The subject line read, For what it's worth. Inside a single line. I didn't fight for you when I should have. If you want sworn testimony about 2016, I'll give it. Below, an attachment, an old thread that showed Malcolm's name in the draft press release, before it was removed. The email's date stamp was the day before the world learned the wrong story about who led what. He handed the phone to Li Zhen. Unexpected, Malcolm said. Men confess when the ground shifts under their houses, Li Zhen replied. He looked at the portfolio and then at Malcolm. So, will you move from their ground to ours? Malcolm's throat tightened. Longing and fear are cousins. Both arrive when you imagine a life you might finally be allowed to live. He pictured his mop standing in the closet like a relic of someone else's survival. He pictured a desk with a window. He pictured a contract template that included a field for grace. Answer me tomorrow, Li Zhen said, kind now. I am not a man who bribes. I am a man who invites. Malcolm nodded slowly. I'll meet Lena at midnight, he said. After that I'll know whether I'm deciding from anger or clarity. Li Zhen stood. He didn't extend a hand for a deal. He took Malcolm's teacup and refilled it. Whatever you decide, you are already not what they say. That is the beginning. They walked out into a lane where laundry hung like flags of ordinary nations, and scooters zipped with the single-mindedness of people making a life. At the corner, Li Zhen's car idled. He opened the door, then paused with one hand on the frame and one foot on the ground, as if straddling two conclusions. Malcolm, he said, switching to English. The words bare and personal. Come build this with me. Permanently. The city noise thinned to a ribbon. The portfolio balanced under Malcolm's arm like a chosen weight. He did not answer yet, but the night felt like it had tilted from trap to threshold, and the word permanent hung between them with the gravity of a door that, once closed behind him, would not open the same way again. The night in Shanghai held a kind of stillness Malcolm hadn't felt in years. The Bund shimmered in the distance, its lights rising and falling like the breath of an animal too large to see in full. He walked the promenade slowly, hands in his pockets, the portfolio from Li Zhen tucked under his arm like a question that would not stop asking itself. He could feel the choice pressing from all sides. On one end, the US, the case, the fight. Staying meant confronting Silvergate head-on, dragging their quiet sabotage into the light, forcing the world to see how neatly racism can dress itself in policy. Staying meant enduring another long winter of half-truths in headlines, of procedural ambushes, of Cliff's smile worn like a weapon. On the other end, China. A desk at LZ Holdings, a position built to value the very skills Silvergate had buried. A life where his fluency wasn't a party trick, but the foundation of his work. It was not escape. Li Zhen would not allow him to disappear into comfort, but it was forward, and forward, after so many years of standing still, was tempting. He stopped by the water's edge. A group of students nearby laughed over street food, voices bright against the low hum of the river. Mandarin, Cantonese, even a snippet of the Hunan dialect he hadn't heard in months. He felt the sound in his chest like a memory pressing a hand there. Belonging, he thought, was not about where you were born. It was about where your skills, your history, and your dignity were allowed to stand without asking permission. Back at the hotel, he laid the portfolio open on the desk. The job description read like a mirror of all the things Silvergate had refused to see in him. Bridge builder, strategist, cultural steward. The salary was generous, yes, but it was the authority it implied, the recognition that made his breath hitch. Still, part of him resisted. He thought of Raina back in New York, still working in facilities, still ducking the invisible wires Cliff set for people like them. He thought of Lena's note, and the students she'd spoken for online. If he left, would it feel like abandoning the fight, or could his leaving be its own kind of statement, proof that he could walk out of a room without needing their permission? The television in the corner hummed low. On one of the English-language channels, a panel debated whether cultural connections in business outweigh protocol. They didn't say his name, but one host grinned as he mentioned the janitor case. Malcolm muted it. He was tired of letting strangers rehearse their opinions about his worth. Near midnight, his phone buzzed. A message from Raina. HQ is moving fast. They've cleared a termination package. Cliff's name is on the memo. Looks like they want you gone before you're back, stateside. Malcolm leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling. The decision was sharpening whether he liked it or not. If he stayed in the US, his fight would start under the shadow of a termination notice. If he left with Li Zhen, he could bypass their attempts entirely, but he'd also be walking away from the chance to make them answer publicly for what they'd done. He poured himself tea from the room's small set, the steam curling in the dim light. He remembered what Li Zhen had said earlier. Men like him are namers. The question is, what do you call it? What would he call it? Self-preservation? Self-respect? Or surrender? By the time dawn began smudging the horizon, He had not decided, but he had begun to frame the decision differently, not as fight or flee, but as fight here or fight there, where he wondered, could he do the most damage to the kind of thinking that had tried to shrink him? In New York within the system that had spat him out, or in Shanghai, where his presence in the boardroom could be a quiet, daily contradiction to every person who thought they knew what leadership looked like. He showered, dressed, and left the hotel early, portfolio in hand. The city was still waking, the air cool and clean. At a street stall he bought breakfast buns, and sat on a bench to eat, watching the workers file into office buildings. The faces were different here, the language constant, but the hierarchies, those were universal. Somewhere in those towers, someone like Cliff was rehearsing how to keep a door closed. And somewhere else, someone like him was standing outside that door, wondering if they'd knock, or build their own. When he returned to the hotel that evening, there was an envelope waiting at the front desk, no sender listed. Heavy paper sealed with wax, his name written in block capitals that did not match Li Zhen's handwriting. He took it upstairs, set it on the desk, and looked at it for a long time before breaking the seal. Inside was no letter, just a single object, a silver key, old-fashioned, the kind that belonged to a desk drawer or a small safe. Taped to it, a slip of paper with 4 words, written in neat, deliberate strokes, "For when you're ready." Malcolm turned the key over in his palm, the metal cold against his skin. He didn't know what it opened or who had decided it belonged to him. But deep down, he knew this. Whatever door it unlocked would change the choice he thought he was making. The silver key lay in Malcolm's palm for a long time before he set it gently on the desk beside the still open portfolio from Li Zhen. It had weight, not just in grams, but in consequence. Whoever had sent it knew exactly what they were doing. "For when you're ready," the note had said, as if the sender had been waiting for him to reach some invisible threshold. He slid the key into his pocket, before heading out to meet Lena at the Bund. The night was brisk, and the water caught the city lights like strands of molten gold. They stood at the railing, no introductions, no small talk. Lena simply handed him a small, battered lockbox. "This is what you came for," she said in Mandarin, her voice low enough to disappear in the wind. "It's been in my family's flat since, before the Shanghai deal. I couldn't trust sending it." "What's in it?" he asked, though the lockbox's cool metal seemed to hum with its own answer. "Things people at your company don't want seen," she said. "I don't mean petty politics, Malcolm. I mean the bones under the floorboards." Back in the hotel, he used the silver key. The lock turned with the stiff protest of something unused for years. Inside, carefully wrapped in brown paper, were manila folders stuffed with printed emails, scanned memos, and annotated spreadsheets. He spread them out on the bed. The paper smelled sharp, old ink bleeding faintly into the fibers. The first folder made his jaw tighten. It was a series of internal HR audits from Silvergate's North American division. Statistics broken down by race, gender, and department. Each page carried polite, bureaucratic phrasing about pipeline limitations and role readiness. But the numbers told a clearer story. Over a 10-year span, less than 3% of senior leadership hires had been black. Promotions for black employees lagged an average of 3.7 years behind equally qualified white counterparts. In client-facing positions, black representation remained under 2%, year after year, despite multiple diversity initiatives. Malcolm flipped to the back and found handwritten notes, meeting minutes not in official records. Cliff's name appeared more than once, usually beside phrases like "hold for optics" or "not front-facing material." The second folder was uglier. It contained email chains between executives, some of them senior enough to shape policy. They discussed candidate lists with coded language, cultural fit, client comfort, background concerns, words that pretended to be neutral but stank of gatekeeping. One email, dated the same year Malcolm had been quietly demoted from consultant to strategic operations support, contained a direct exchange between Cliff and another manager. From C. Harding to S. Mart. "If we keep him in high-visibility deals, we risk losing the Shanghai investors. They expect a certain profile in the room." Merton's reply had been curt. From S. Mart to C. Harding.
"Then move him off the board, quietly."
Malcolm sat back, the papers limp in his hands. There it was. Not suspicion, not implication, but proof. The kind that could live in headlines and lawsuits. The third folder was a map of complicity. It held internal memos about the diversity task force Silvergate had proudly announced to the press 2 years ago. The documents revealed the task force was largely a branding exercise, its recommendations shelved, its meeting minutes scrubbed before being shared with shareholders. A sticky note in one margin, likely from the whistleblower who had assembled these files, read simply, "This is your smoking gun." There were also payroll records highlighting disparities in bonuses, especially for black employees in revenue-generating roles. In one case, a black account executive had brought in the highest client retention rate in her division yet received a bonus half the size of her white colleagues. Malcolm realized he was gripping the paper too tightly. The corner had bent under his fingers. He didn't know how long he sat there reading. The city's neon spilling through the curtains. At some point the tea on the desk had gone cold. What he held was more than ammunition against Cliff. This was a warhead, one that could crater Silvergate's leadership, maybe the entire North American branch. And with that realization came the second truth, the one that landed heavier. This would also scorch the people who had nothing to do with it. Reina, the junior analysts who had spoken Mandarin to him in passing, without suspicion. The interns trying to pay rent. Collateral damage doesn't care about innocence. It only cares about proximity. His phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. If you go public, you won't be able to control the fallout. Think about who else burns. No name. No sender ID. Just the warning. He stood, pacing the length of the room. His instinct was to fight, to drag the truth into light, and watch the architects of this rot squint under it. But this wasn't just about truth. It was about consequences. Li Zhen's offer waited in the portfolio, clean and forward-looking. These papers were the opposite, a pull backward into a fight that could consume years. He imagined handing the files to a journalist. The headlines, the interviews, the inevitable counterattacks, questioning his competence, his integrity, spinning the whistleblower. As a disgruntled ex-employee, he'd seen it happen to others, truth buried under noise until the public shrugged and moved on.
There was another option.
He could use the evidence as leverage, not publicity, a quiet threat to force Silvergate into settling his case, rewriting his record, maybe even making policy changes they'd otherwise ignore. It wouldn't be public justice, but it could be strategic.
The cost.
The story would never reach the people who deserved to know. He sat back down, reading one email again and again, the one with Cliff's name. The arrogance in the phrasing was almost casual, like this was simply how business was done. That more than the numbers made his pulse quicken. They hadn't even considered the possibility that their words might one day be read by the man they were trying to erase. A knock broke his thoughts. He crossed the room and opened the door to find no one. Just another envelope, slid under the frame. Inside was a single sheet of paper, printed from an internal Silvergate memo, marked confidential. It was dated yesterday. Subject, Rhodes Matter, Contingency Planning, from EVP, North America, to C. Harding, S. Mercer, Legal. If Rhodes escalates or engages media, proceed with narrative B. Emphasize non-performance and lack of qualifications for senior roles. Prepare background checks on personal life. Hire private firm if necessary. Frame Mandarin fluency as a relevant hobby skill, not business asset. Beneath it, in pen, a note from the whistleblower. They're already sharpening their knives. Decide fast. Malcolm set the paper down. The weight of the decision was now doubled. He could destroy them before they destroyed him, but in doing so he might also destroy people who had never held the knife. And yet doing nothing meant letting Cliff and his cohort script his ending. He thought of Lena's students, of Reina's steady hands, of Li Zhen's calm voice telling him to build different rooms. He thought of his younger self in Beijing, fresh off a plane, believing that language was the most powerful bridge a person could carry. He looked at the files spread before him. The lockbox open like a wound. He didn't know which road he would take yet. But one thing was certain. The choice would define more than his career. It would define who he was willing to be when the truth was his to wield. As he began gathering the papers back into the folders, a faint thump sounded against the hotel window. He turned and froze, pressed against the glass from the outside. Barely visible in the reflection of the city lights was a white envelope, taped to the pane. Written on it, in thick black marker, were 3 words that made his chest tighten. We're not alone. The envelope on the window felt like a breath on the back of his neck. Malcolm eased it free from the tape and slid a finger beneath the flap. Inside he found a cheap burner phone, plastic light, screen scratched, and a single sheet of paper folded twice. 3 instructions, printed in block letters. Scan the documents on this device. Upload to the secure drop pre-installed. Redact names of junior staff. Send to 2 targets. Civil Rights Council. Investigative journalist. Trust the river. At the bottom a line in Mandarin. Brushstroke elegant. When one boat crosses, others appear. No signature. No hint of who had left it 15 floors up on a sealed window. He listened to the room. Air hum. City murmur. His own pulse. Then he moved. He spread the files again, heat returning to purpose. Page by page, he photographed audits, emails, memos, pausing to black out names of receptionists, assistants, anyone who hadn't wielded a blade. Executives he left visible. Policies, numbers, timelines he left as they were, unarguable. When the last page flashed green on the screen, the phone's single app opened to a blank field and a pulsing cursor. Drop initiated. He watched the progress bar crawl. At 100%, 2 buttons bloomed. Counsel and journalist. He chose both. The device vibrated once. Delivered. He set the burner on the sill and leaned his forehead to the cool glass. Somewhere in this web of towers, someone else was awake. Someone who had slid a message across a city to say, "You are not alone." He let that fact fill the hollows the documents had carved. The silence lasted 8 minutes, then the first tremor. A small civil rights account posted a thread dry, surgical, devastating, walking through a decade of numbers at Silvergate. Leadership tiers pale by design, promotions slowed like molasses for black staff, bonuses cut by performance curves that always seemed to curve away from the same bodies. Screenshots followed. Cliff's emails, redactions neat. The phrase certain profile underlined in crimson digital ink. The thread didn't call him a villain. It called the system by its name. 90 minutes later, the journalist piece hit. Headline simple as a verdict. Documents reveal pattern of racial gatekeeping at Silvergate Financial. Within an hour it climbed to the top of the site. Within 2, broadcast anchors were polishing the story for people buttering toast. A flood opened. Former employees chimed in with corroborations and wounds. They told me I wasn't client ready the day after I landed the client. My Mandarin was cute. My white peer's Duolingo was promising. Someone dug up the glossy photo of the diversity task force. A row of smiling faces in grayscale. Now, alongside the leaked minutes that showed its suggestions shelved, the picture looked like a museum exhibit. Hope, taxidermy. By late morning in New York, sidewalks outside Silvergate's headquarters blushed with bodies. Not a tidal wave at first. More a gathering weather. Handwritten signs crowded the curb. Let us in the room. Numbers don't lie. People do. Merit no mirror. A woman in a navy coat stood at the front, megaphone low at her waist. Voice calm, relentless. "We know how stories are bent," she said. "We're here to hold them straight." In the glass lobby, lilies looked suddenly like props. Camila from PR hovered with a phone at her ear. Orchestral in her triage. "We need a second statement," she told her team. Vowels clipped to fit urgency. "No, not another cloud. Something with verbs and admissions, and pull the line about all contributions. It backfires every time." Cliff watched from the mezzanine, a vantage point that had always flattered him. Today it made him visible to the wrong audience. A protester in the front row pointed up and 50 faces turned. He stepped back out of sight, the old instinct control the frame, arriving late to a party already filmed from every angle. "Sir," a junior partner said, hovering in the doorway to his office. "Legal needs you. And HR says the building access logs are being FOIA'd." He winced. Apparently that's a thing. Cliff buttoned his jacket like armor. "Conference room B," he said. "Bring Perul. Bring Sloan." As the junior left, Cliff's phone buzzed. "Unknown number," he answered and got a voice like tempered glass. "This is Angela Carr, with the Civil Rights Division," she said. "We've received documents of concern regarding hiring and promotion practices at Silvergate. You will be receiving a preservation notice within the hour. Do not destroy records." Cliff swallowed. "We comply with all laws," he said, reflex saluting denial. "Good," Kara replied. "We also expect your presence at an initial fact-finding session. Short notice." A pause that was not a negotiation. "Tomorrow, 10 a.m. "Tomorrow?" He glanced at legal's door, where Perul was already gathering folders. "We're not prepared. Preparation is less relevant when facts are not in dispute," Carr said, tone unchanged. "You'll get the formal notice by email. Good day." The line died. Cliff stared at his reflection in the dark phone screen. A man rehearsing gravity. Outside, chants braided into a rhythm. Inside, printers hummed. Perul entered with eyes that matched the day's risk level. High alert copper. Preservation notice? She asked. Cliff nodded. Federal. Then no draft deletions, no slacks wiped, no lost drives. Perul said. We lock the house. She sat, palms flat on the table. Crisis Rule 1. Tell the truth faster than they can catch you in a lie. He gave a humorless smile. And Crisis Rule 2? Don't improvise on the phone with the government. Noted, he said just as his desktop pinged with an email flagged urgent. He opened it and read the words that reordered his afternoon. Subpoena testimony. Requested. The sender U.S. Commission on Civil Rights Tri-State Field Office. The subject line included his name and a date. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. He didn't say a word. He just slid the screen toward Perul. Her eyes skimmed, lifted. Cliff, she said softly. They want you on the record. Across the world, the river outside Malcolm's hotel window moved like a clock that refused to be hurried. He watched coverage roll in from 2 languages at once. Protest footage charts from the leak, the same photograph of him in a chalky Hunan classroom, pulled from Lena's threat. Reporters had already named the story. He did not need to. His burner pinged with a message from the journalist. We verified 3 sources inside your company. Others are coming forward. If you want to go on record, we'll protect you as a named whistleblower. But the story doesn't need you to be sacrificed to be true. He typed slowly. I won't be the bait. He deleted the sentence. He typed again. Redact junior staff in any follow-ups. They didn't build this. The reply came fast. Already done. Raina called. Breath quick. They shut down internal chat. She said. It put a banner on our screens. Preserve records. Do not delete. Sloane looks like she swallowed a file cabinet. You okay? He asked. I'm furious. Which is one kind of okay, she answered. I'm also seeing kids with signs out front and thinking maybe this is how rooms change when doors won't. Stay away from the front, he said reflexively. She snorted. I am the front, and hung up before he could protect her into silence. By afternoon in New York, the sidewalk had thickened into an artery. A line of employees, some in suits, some in cardigans, stood behind the crowd, faces tense as if their jobs were printed on their foreheads. A black analyst spoke to a local camera with her voice low but firm. We want a place where our competence isn't translated as attitude, she said, where our fluency, any kind, counts. Inside, the board huddled by teleconference. Someone from HQ asked whether they should distance from the North American team. Someone else suggested appointing an interim head of culture. A bandage with a title, Camila said. No more abstractions. Admit specifics. Announce an independent audit. Carew said. And stop saying optics. It's a test. Cliff said very little. He was thinking of the subpoena in his inbox, and the emails in the lockbox that had crawled onto the internet like daylight. He pictured the commission room, microphones, flag, a stenographer who would write his pauses as faithfully as his words. He had built a life inside rooms where the outcome could be managed. This would not be one of them. That night, the first aerial shots appeared, a river of people, along a line of glass, signs bobbing in a synchronized tide. Hashtags braided, let him into room, translate the gate, numbers are honest, and bled into languages the building hadn't tried to understand. A young man painted a banner with a sentence from the leak in block letters. Protection that requires me to forget who I am is not protection. The quote was attributed to Li Zhen. Cameras loved it. So did the crowd. Malcolm stood at his window and felt the storm cross oceans to meet him. He didn't taste triumph. He tasted cost. He imagined the facility's night crew in New York, slipping past protest lines to clean bathrooms that didn't belong to them and might never. He imagined Sloane counting stress balls. He imagined Cliff laying out a suit, each thread a sturdy lie. His hotel phone rang. He picked up. Li Zhen's voice carried warmth and iron. The river moves, Li said. You pushed. Others pushed. It will find its bed. Beds flood, Malcolm said. People drown. Yes, Li Zhen replied. And sometimes banks are carved where they were supposed to be, all along. A pause. Tomorrow they asked your Mr. Harding to testify. How do you know? Men who mistake rooms for kingdoms forget walls are thin. Said gently. Sleep. Decide your answer to my invitation in the morning. I won't ask twice. After the call, Malcolm placed the burner on the sill like an offering and lay on the bed without undressing. The documents were packed again in their folders. The lockbox closed. He set Lejeun's portfolio on his chest and watched the ceiling until the city dimmed its eyes. In the morning, New York woke to rain. The protest didn't thin. Umbrellas tattooed the sidewalk in a polka dot resolve. Inside, Cliff stood at a mirror knotting a tie, fingers steady despite the tremor running under his skin. He sounded out sentences in a voice just above a whisper. We strive to build inclusive teams. We acknowledge the pain caused. We are commissioning an independent review. We reject the characterization of systemic bias. He stopped at the last line. He heard Angela Carr's voice again. Facts are not in dispute, and felt for a brief unguarded second the floor tilt. His phone buzzed. A calendar alert flared. U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, testimony, Harding. Beneath it a message from Perul. Do not improvise. Do not speculate. Answer only what is asked. He slipped on his jacket. Outside the rain sounded like static. Down in the lobby, Camila pressed a statement into his hand. If they ask about Malcolm, she said, don't smear him. It will backfire. Speak to policy. Speak to process. Cliff nodded as if his head knew what his spine refused. He stepped into the car. The driver pulled into traffic that had its own opinion about urgency. At the commission building, cameras nested like birds. A woman with a mic called his name. A man with a sign called something else. Cliff kept his eyes on the door. He pushed through the metal detector and into the hall where portraits watched from frames. A clerk handed him a packet and pointed toward the double doors of hearing room A. He paused before the threshold, thumb unconsciously pressing the edge of the subpoena in his pocket. On the other side, microphones. A flag, the stenographer. The questions that would not permit exit through charisma. The clerk's voice echoed down the marble. Mr. Harding, they're ready for you. He smoothed his tie, set his face, and reached for the handle, just as his phone vibrated again. One line from an unknown sender blinked on the screen. If you lie today, the second envelope opens. Cliff stood at the threshold of hearing room A, with the text still glowing on his phone. If you lie today, the second envelope opens. He swallowed it like a pill, slid the phone face down into his breast pocket, and pushed through the doors. The room felt colder than the marble hall. Panel table up front, seal and flag behind it, rows of chairs filling with reporters, advocates, employees who'd taken the morning off to watch someone else's courage. The stenographer's machine waited like a metronome. At the center sat Angela Carr, eyes steady, flanked by two commissioners and counsel. To her right, an empty witness chair. To her left, a monitor already lit with a waiting video feed. Shanghai's skyline bled into a corner of the frame. Cliff took his seat at counsel table. Perul leaned close. Answer what's asked, she whispered. No more, no less. Across the aisle, an assistant adjusted the angle on the monitor. The video sharpened. Malcolm appeared in crisp focus. A neutral background behind him. No attempt to perform grandeur. Just a face that looked like it had slept enough to make decisions he'd stand by. The chair's gavel sounded once. On the record, Kerr said. This is a fact-finding session concerning allegations of discriminatory hiring and promotion practices at Silvergate Financial. We'll begin with Mr. Harding. Cliff stood. The oath felt like a ritual he'd rehearsed, but the words landed heavier today, as if the room had changed gravity overnight. He sat carefully. Kerr began. Dates, titles, the chain of command, then language. Mr. Harding, she said. Emails entered into the record contain phrases such as client comfort, profile in the room, and not front-facing material. In your experience, what do those phrases mean? They're shorthand, Cliff said smoothly. Client-facing suitability requires soft skills. We need representatives who match client expectations of professionalism. And what does profile refer to? Experience, demeanor, presentation. Kerr didn't blink. Does it refer to race? Of course not, Cliff said. The of course a bridge to safer ground. We strictly prohibit discrimination. She slid a printed exhibit toward him. Exhibit 14. Internal email. Your account. If we keep him in high-visibility deals, we risk losing the Shanghai investors. They expect a certain profile in the room. Who is him? Cliff felt his throat narrow. Context matters. We were discussing seniority. The him is Mr. Rhodes? Carr asked. Perul's hand brushed his sleeve under the table. A reminder to measure. The him referred to a junior team member, Cliff said. At the time Mr. Rhodes was in facilities, Kerr let the lie sit between them like something gassy. We'll come back. She turned to the screen. Mr. Rhodes, can you hear us? I can, Malcolm said. His voice sounded the same as the boardroom, but the room reshaped it, a public register that asked you to mean it. You're under oath, Kerr said. We've received documents you claim show a pattern of racial gatekeeping. Describe your experience with phrases like culture fit and client comfort. They're weather phrases, Malcolm said. They pretend to describe the sky. They're actually instructions about who's allowed to stand in the sun. A murmur eased through the back row. Carr nodded, not to agree but to advance. Did anyone explicitly tell you your race was a factor in removing you from client-facing work? Explicitly? No, Malcolm said. Plainly, yes. In 2016, my contribution to a Shenzhen deal was erased from a press release. When I asked why, HR told me the client wanted someone who looked like the face of the deal. Cliff kept his face still, but the word looked scraped his teeth. Kerr lifted another exhibit. Exhibit 22. An email thread from that period showing Mr. Rhodes named in a draft release, then removed the next day. Mr. Harding, you're CC'd. Cliff angled forward. Comms decisions are centralized, he said. I don't edit press releases. The thread includes your comment, Carr replied evenly. She read. Not front-facing material. Did you write that? Parula's finger pressed down. Answer only. Cliff heard the unknown texter in his pocket. Yes, he said. I did. On what basis? Role alignment, he said. He wasn't in a client role. And if he had been, Cliff glanced at the door. No one came to save him. Then we'd still consider alignment. Carr turned the page. Let's move forward, she said. After the Shanghai negotiation last week, Mr. Rhodes's hours were changed. His directory listing removed, and he was placed on leave. Help us understand the timing. Operational needs, Cliff said. With unexpected media attention, we needed to centralize communications and prevent misstatements by staff. So you removed the only person who could clarify in 2 languages. Carr asked. He didn't answer. The stenographer recorded the silence. A commissioner leaned toward the mic. Mr. Rhodes, your leak redacted junior staff. Why? Because they didn't hold the knife. Malcolm said. The people who wrote policy did. Cliff felt heat crawl under his collar. Something like shame tried to sit down at his table. He didn't let it. Kerr stacked the exhibits. We also have records of bonus disparities and promotion lags for black employees. Mr. Harding, did you review these audits? I saw summaries, he said. We're improving. We have a task force, whose recommendations were shelved, Carr said, sliding the minutes into view. Perul interjected gently. Council would like to note that the task force is advisory. Carr's eyes didn't move. Advisory is not a synonym for imaginary. She pivoted. Final line of questions, Mr. Harding. Did you direct HR to open an employment review of Mr. Rhodes after the Shanghai meeting? We discussed process to protect the firm, he said. Did you direct it? Yes, he said. Was there a specific incident of misconduct? Unauthorized eye representation, he said. Travel on a client's aircraft without approval. Did the client's insistence change your view? Clients can insist on many things, he said. We protect the firm. Carr let out a breath that was almost a laugh. She turned to the screen. Mr. Rhodes, one more. Why didn't you shake Mr. Vale's hand? Malcolm didn't blink. Because I won't provide optics to the men who delete names. Somewhere behind Cliff, someone exhaled like a held note finally done. Carr nodded once. The end of an equation. We'll break for 10 minutes, she said. Then we'll deliver preliminary findings. The room stood and rearranged itself into whispers. Cliff remained seated. His phone hummed again. A second unknown text. Envelope 2 placed with counsel. Speak carefully. He scanned the rows and saw nothing but faces. When the panel returned, the room settled with a sound like fabric sighing. Tari's voice lost its warmth because it had work to do. These are preliminary, she said. But clear enough. She enumerated a pattern of disparate impact in promotions and bonuses. Coded language used as a proxy for race. Retaliation reasonably inferred from timing. A directive to remove an employee after protected activity. We refer these findings to the EEOC and DOJ for further action, she said. We will request a court-ordered monitor if systemic violation is confirmed. Cliff's spine remembered how to be a rod. He didn't move. He didn't look at Perul. He watched the stenographer type his future in present tense. Care wasn't done. As to Mr. Rhodes, we recommend immediate reinstatement. Restoration of pay, front pay for lost promotion opportunities, and an offer of settlement for damages. A low wave rolled across the room. Reporters bent over screens. The camera light on the back wall blinked alive like an eye. Care turned to the monitor. "Mr. Rhodes, do you wish to respond?" Malcolm seemed to breathe once. For the entire room. "I hear the remedies," he said. "I'm grateful for the clarity, but I won't take a settlement that buys my silence. I won't be reinstated into a room that refuses to be different." Tara's pen paused mid-note. "To be clear," she said, "you decline?" "I decline money that ends the story," Malcolm said. "I'll accept only this, a public admission, an independent monitor with teeth, promotion criteria codified and audited, and a commitment that governance learns the languages it manages. Make the room different. Or I walk." Peril's head snapped up. "Or I walk from what?" She thought, from whom? Cliff's jaw clenched. Not at the refusal, but at the terms. It was the first demand he'd heard in years, that sounded like a blueprint rather than a headline. Care looked from the screen to Cliff, then back. "We are not a court," she said. "We recommend, but recommendations have gravity." She lifted the gavel just enough to threaten sound. "Silvergate will respond within 10 business days, with a corrective plan. Mr. Harding, you will return for further testimony after document production. Mr. Rhodes, you may submit additional materials under seal." She tapped the gavel once. The room stood as if tugged by a string. Reporters surged. Peril touched Cliff's sleeve. "We'll draft," she said under the noise, "and pray." On the screen, Malcolm didn't log off. He looked past the camera, as if checking whether the river was still there. Then he glanced down and shifted a folder into view. The cream paper of Li Zhen's offer, the title glinting under Shanghai light. He slid it closed with a soft final motion, lifted his eyes to the room 3 continents away, and let the silence say what his mouth didn't. He had refused, the easy out. And somewhere in the back row, a courier stepped into the aisle with a padded envelope stamped evidence. Video. The label addressed Commission Counsel. The courier raised it just as Cliff turned and saw for the first time the handwriting on its seal. The second envelope had arrived. The rain had lifted in New York, but in the university's glass auditorium, the air still smelled faintly of wet pavement and coffee. Students in robes green trimmed with silver shifted in their seats as the hum of pre-ceremony chatter floated upward toward the skylight. On the stage, a lectern waited beneath the crest of Columbia School of International Affairs. The seal was embossed in gold, a deliberate gleam under the spotlight. Backstage, Malcolm adjusted the knot of his tie. It was the same one he had worn in Shanghai, not for superstition, but because it felt like unfinished business. He smoothed the knot, inhaled, and heard the murmur of hundreds of futures beyond the curtain. An usher touched his elbow. "You're up in 2, she said, smiling with the unguarded pride of someone who knew his story. Maybe too well. He stepped out into applause, not roaring, but warm, textured with curiosity. The dean introduced him in English, her cadence slow enough for the interpreters. She spoke of his unconventional path from international consultancy to janitorial work to becoming a figure of integrity in the face of systemic injustice. She did not say whistleblower. She did not say racial gatekeeping. But the students knew. Their eyes held the knowledge the internet had carried faster than any institution. Malcolm reached the lectern. He rested his hands on either side, feeling the grain of the wood, and let the applause taper into a silence. You could hear your own breathing in. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady, almost conversational. "When I was your age, I thought the language that mattered most was English. Then I learned Mandarin. Then I learned something harder, that the most important language in any room is the one people aren't expecting you to speak." Heads tilted, pens poised above programs. "I've been called articulate," he continued, "which is often said to me the way some people compliment a parrot. As though speech is surprising when it comes from a beak they didn't think could form the words. And I've been called invisible, sometimes in boardrooms, sometimes in hallways, sometimes in the language of "we'll circle back," and not a culture fit." He paused, then switched to Mandarin, with a fluency so fluid it sounded like a river changing its course. A ripple moved through the audience. Graduates from Beijing, Guangzhou, Taipei leaning forward instinctively. "In another life," he said in Mandarin, "I taught English in a village where my students' only dictionary was me. They asked why I'd come so far from home. I told them because I believe language is a bridge, and every bridge changes the 2 shores it connects." On the third row, Li Zhen smiled. Small, proud. The way someone might look at a building they helped lay the foundation for. Malcolm alternated between English and Mandarin, letting each language carry a weight the other could not. In the corporate world, I learned that bridges scare people who profit from the river staying wild. They will call you overqualified, then underqualified, sometimes in the same sentence. They will move your desk to the basement and tell you it's for efficiency. They will cut your name from the press release and call it strategy. And if you speak a language they don't, they will pretend it's irrelevant until they need it to save a billion-dollar deal. A low laugh, rueful and knowing, rippled through the hall. He didn't name Silvergate. He didn't have to. I had a choice, he continued, to take a settlement that would have padded my bank account, or to demand changes that might never fully happen in my lifetime. I chose the latter, not because I am noble, but because I could not unsee what I had seen. I could not go back to mopping floors in silence, knowing I had the words to name the dirt. He shifted into Mandarin again, slower this time, each word deliberate. If they don't understand your language, teach it to them. If they refuse to learn, speak so loudly that someone else hears and answers you back. The interpreter's voices floated through headsets, but the cadence of Malcolm's delivery kept the attention in the original. I am here, he said in English now, because a man named Li Jin decided that a janitor who spoke Mandarin was worth listening to. I am here because a teacher in Hunan once told me that every student becomes a teacher if they live long enough, and I am here because I believe that the dignity we keep for ourselves is the dignity we teach others to keep for themselves. From the corner of his eye, Malcolm caught movement. Near the side aisle, Cliff had entered quietly, out of the suit and tie, wearing a muted jacket. No entourage, no camera crew. He didn't sit, he stood in the shadows near the back, listening. Malcolm's tone didn't change, but inside something in him registered the shift. Two men in the same room, not because of subpoena or boardroom, but because the story had carried them here. To the graduates, Malcolm said, I ask you to remember this. Rooms are not neutral. They are built to include some and exclude others. When you enter a room, listen for the voices missing from it. When you find them, open the door wider, and if the hinges are rusted shut, he leaned in slightly. Bring oil or bring fire. He paused, switching to Mandarin for the close. The hall seemed to still further. They thought I was invisible. I just learned to speak in a language they couldn't ignore. The English translation followed a beat later through the interpreters, but the weight of the Mandarin version hung in the air like incense. Something you felt before you fully processed it. Applause rose, not polite, not obligatory, but rolling, sustained. Students stood, some clapping, some recording, a few wiping eyes. Li Jun rose too, his hands meeting in deliberate rhythm. Backstage, as the dean thanked him, Malcolm caught sight of Cliff leaving through the side exit. No words, no nod, just the quiet departure of a man who had heard what he'd come to hear, or what he couldn't unhear. Outside, the campus lawn was alive with caps, gowns and the light scent of magnolia. Li Jun found him near the steps. You chose your road, Li said in Mandarin, approval hidden but present. No settlement, no salary, just the work. Just the work, Malcolm echoed. It's enough. They stood there, two men from different continents, who had met in a room built to keep one of them out. Malcolm looked at the students flooding the quad, some speaking English, some Mandarin, some languages neither he nor Li Jin could place. It was a noise he wanted to carry with him, a reminder that bridges could be built from sound alone. As the sky deepened into late afternoon, he stepped down the stone path toward the waiting crowd of new graduates. The applause from the hall still clung to the air, but his final words lingered longer, etched into the ears of those who had been listening. Whether from the front row or the back shadows, Malcolm adjusted his tie one last time, the Shanghai knot sitting neatly under his collar, and thought, they thought I was invisible. I just learned to speak in a language they couldn't ignore, and for the first time in years, he knew he would never need to raise his voice to be heard again. Some doors never open on their own. Someone has to push. If Malcolm's fight taught us anything, it's that silence protects the wrong side of history. The next time you see a voice being buried, ask yourself, whose truth are they trying to erase? Because the